एको हो रहा है बंदे की ऑडियो पूरी। तो अब यहाँ पे तो नहीं होगा बिकॉज ऑल्सो द वीडियोग्राफर इज टू बी इंस्ट्रक्टेड कि ये रैंडम घूमते हुए लाइव नहीं करना है। उनको बोल दो रैंडम जब घूम रहे हैं लोग तो लाइव नहीं करना है, सिर्फ सेशन का बैनर डिस्प्ले होगा तब। वो पीछे बोल दो। शुभदीप का वो लेकर आया, वो प्रिंट नहीं हुआ था। क्या हुआ?
No, no.
कुछ
मुझे
हुआ ना?
नहीं नहीं मुझे दिमाग में मुझे आपको लगा मुझे ब्रो our session is starting in 10 minutes.
Is she the liaising officer? Dhruv is it?
Blue and what?
She gave attitude again.
Huh?
She gave attitude.
She doesn't give. वो तो कर देगी.
Anyway, वीडियोग्राफर को इंस्ट्रक्ट करना है कि डोंट रोमिंग अराउंड में नहीं, रोमिंग अराउंड में, हाँ इधर रख दो सर। रोमिंग अराउंड मोहित को नहीं पता है। द वीडियोग्राफर इज टू बी टोल्ड कि व्हेन पीपल आर रोमिंग अराउंड प्लीज डोंट स्ट्रीम, इट्स ऑड। ओनली स्टार्ट स्ट्रीमिंग 5 मिनट। यार पूरी ऑडियो है हो रही है। अरे वो ना एक बार, अच्छा कोई और नहीं। उनको टेस्ट भी करना चाहिए कि जब जूम चल रही है, लुक योहान का ऑडियो कितना ऑड आ रहा है। Can't hear anything, it's echoed.
मुझे लगता है मेरे सिस्टम में मुझे रिकॉर्ड नहीं है तो मुझे पता नहीं लेकिन बोल तो रही है Zoom already done the live session with the event right.
Thank you, Johan. Excellent. For my next question, Dr. Gupta, within the scope of the Act, the rules and hence are completely out of the subject matter which you want to regulate. What it really means is some sort of an amendment has to happen, either as a fresh law or as a IT Act itself. Second is, don't look into maybe as Divyaji has mentioned, and don't, or maybe Aman has also mentioned, don't try to solve all the problems in one go. Otherwise, it will lead to a fatigue.
You are the moderator? No, no, I'm not. I just need to charge my laptop. And the speakers are running about, they are like 30, they were at 9 o'clock, they were 30 minutes away. So they are 5-10 minutes away, like late. So we will have to start like 5-10 minutes late.
So, but this is the BIF dialogue, the dialogue together doing it. So it's
Yeah.
being stitched together by.
Which people will then start ignoring. So
It's a small.
They've only given us 2 mics. They said that they have another session.
हाँ दैट इज
If
ओके।
you look at
तो
it
ये
actually,
4 स्पीकर है सपोज, तो या तो बताओगे
We have 2 rolling mics.
एक काम करो, एक रोलिंग रख लो, एक मॉडरेटर को दे दो और 2 ऐसे रख लो कि एक स्पीकर एक स्पीकर।
एक बार बैठ के देखेंगे ना तब पता चलेगा
बैठ
कितना
जाओ,
आसपास। ये अभी मैं बना के दे रही हूँ, सर्टिफिकेट छूट जाती है, साथ में रेडी करके
बैठो
रखेंगे।
जल्दी से बैठो। आई थिंक इट मेक सेंस, ऐसे करके ऐसे हो जाता है, नॉट अ प्रॉब्लम। हाँ हाँ ऑफ कोर्स, ऐसे करके 2 लोगों के बीच में माइक शेयर हो जाता है।
And ask them, do we need, they've not given us any update on notepads, etc. Notepads is okay. We also
हाँ
need
साइड में रख दो, यहाँ ये साइड में रखे रहना, बट यूज
एक
मत
मॉनिटर
करना,
यूज
ठीक
कर
है?
लेगा ना वो तो
हाँ।
ये स्पीकर्स के लिए हो जाएगा।
ट्रू, बट 3 स्पीकर हैं तो एनीवे डजंट। हाँ वेयर आर द,
They've just given us this, they've not given us placards.
तो ऐसे ही रख दो फिर, ऐसे
ऐसे ऐसे
थोड़ा उसको एक काम करो।
They told us ki hai, but
Yeah,
the
they
office
said,
will
yeah.
open at 9. So
Like the basement office is there.
Nine
Show
हो गए।
20.
हाँ इट्स 9:20।
एक second अगर invitation
चेक करके आ
वो ये
जाओ।
तो है ही नहीं यार, अच्छा नहीं लगेगा।
Azim this is not
Jamila is there.
Jamila,
Apurva,
Subhodip Jain.
Subhodip Jain,
Jayesh,
SH
Subhadeep has it, so he did not
It's okay.
Abhi to
Speakers.
plan.
He's a speaker. Tell Ranjit. I had sent the speaker names
So
yesterday.
Ranjit sir is still printing the new names which you sent yesterday. वो अभी हो रहे हैं print. Once they get here, I'll
तो
get it.
शुभदीप इज वन न्यू नेम ना, वो लेकर आ जाओ, वो लेकर आ जाओ। इसको एक काम करो, एक और अगर प्लेन शीट है ना तो वो लेकर आओगे तो इसके पीछे इट विल बिकम थिकर, इट विल बी इजीियर
Like double कर दें.
हाँ दैट्स व्हाट।
ठीक है, I'll try and arrange those.
प्लेन शीट तो अरेंज हो जाएगी।
No, no, मतलब पहले भी पड़ी हुई है ना हमारे पास. And time sheets do you need here? I have some from yesterday.
Yeah, please.
ठीक है, I'll get them.
Speakers are running. I have some time, but I need you to please be fast. And ये हटाओ इसको साइड में। आह, अपूर्वा और इसका क्या आज नहीं चलेगा? हाँ ठीक है जय भी, अब जो है सो है। आई नीड क्विकली टू इसका। हाँ एक और नाम है अभी इसमें, नीचे प्रिंट नहीं
होल्डर
पता नहीं होल्डर नाम है। थोड़ा जल्दी करो, स्पीकर्स लेट हैं बट 9:25 हो रहे हैं। और नीचे से लोग देखो, तीन कितने लोग हैं मैनेज अभी एक एक कर लो ना। एक बंदा मुझे लोग लेकर आ जाएगा और एक बंदा ये सब काम कर लेगा।
कितने लोग बैठेंगे?
4 लोग बैठेंगे। एक और बंदा है शुभोदीप जश, उसका प्रिंट नहीं हुआ है, वो नीचे प्रिंट कराते हैं।
ठीक है.
हाँ
Already
मुझे ये
दे
चाहिए,
दिया
अगर
नीचे
वो
आपने?
है तो प्लीज ये ले आओ।
मैं वही कह ऑलरेडी दे दिया नीचे print करने?
हाँ ये शुभोदीप जश का दे दिया, और वो लोग आ भी रहे हैं अभी 5-10 मिनट में, लेट चल रहे हैं।
4 से ज्यादा लोग तो नहीं बैठेंगे ना अभी टाइम?
नहीं
If everything is getting leveled, then also it
मुझे 4 तो वो चाहिए प्लेटफॉर्म होंगे. और ना एक नेम प्लेट बनने दी थी सुबोधी नाम से.
हाँ जी
रणजीत सर से पूछना, मैं बताती हूँ.
सॉरी
सुबोधीप
वो आ
जश.
रही आ रही है,
मैं
शी इज ऑन हर
एक दिन मैं ना उनके नाम की फोटो भेज रही हूँ तुम्हें खींच के रणजीत सर को दिखाती हूँ कि नेम प्लेट बनवा के लाने का. पता नहीं उनके पास बनने आई है
आ
कि
रहे
नहीं
वो
आई है.
नीचे टैग्स उनका आ
हाँ
रहे
4
हैं।
मिनट में तुम्हें फोटो भेज रही हूँ उस नाम की बनेगी.
Our speakers are running late, little late, 5-10 minutes. हाँ
अच्छा तुम भी हो क्या इसमें?
मैं नहीं, मैं तो
Manage
ना
कर लो।
लैपटॉप चाहती हूँ।
गुड मॉर्निंग। But these rooms for workshops, these kind of rooms are fantastic. They are small, compact. We don't need bigger rooms. Isn't that main hall is
Yeah,
big for us?
yeah.
Yes, it is.
ये आप करवा रहे हो arrange?
thanks for that question. And if I'm permitted to ask something I just said previously, grab off this back, right?
Morning everyone, welcome to day 2 of India IGF. This is workshop 9, AI Innovation and Copyright, co-organized by the Dialogue and we're just waiting on one speaker, but in the meanwhile we'll request the moderator and the panelists to join us on the dais. I'd request Ms. Jamila Sahiba, who's the moderator, to please come on the dais. Ms. Apurva Murli, partner Shadul Amarchand Mangaldas. Mr. Shubhadeep Josh from the Asia Group. And we are waiting on Ms. Aditi Agarwal. In the meanwhile, I'll hand it over to Ms. Jamila to start the session. She'll be joining in about 5 minutes.
Thanks, Shubhika, and welcome to all on this workshop that we're conducting at the intersection of AI and copyright. It's a pleasure for the Dialogue to co-host it along with the BIF, and we look forward to some of the insights that come out of this discussion today. And just a quick introduction for myself, I essentially am an associate director at the Dialogue, and I lead their work on AI, and AI and copyright has been something that I've been closely working on in terms of research, but also in terms of the engagement that we've been sort of doing with the government on understanding what approach is the Indian government taking towards building a more cohesive bridge in terms of advancing India's digital future, right? And it does tie up with a lot of the laws in the country, copyright being one of them. So today's panel is essentially going to look into, what are some of the global approaches that different countries are taking towards this intersection on AI and copyright. How is it that we can learn from some of those approaches? What are the key gaps that exist in the Indian ecosystem right now? And what could be some of the ways that we can align on in terms of the immediate next steps or any broader recommendations that this panel can sort of look into? So that will be the broad idea for today's panel. I welcome all my co-panelists. It's a pleasure to sort of have them here early morning. So thank you so much for being a part of this. I think while we wait for Aditi, I will start the discussion just in the interest of time. So my first question will be to you, Apurva. We've been seeing, the whole idea of today's panel is to understand, a comparative perspective of how different countries are approaching the whole intersection of AI and copyright, right? So towards that, in countries, there are rule-based countries where TDM exceptions have been allowed, whereas there are other countries like the US where they're broadly talking about open-ended doctrines like the fair use doctrine, right? So from that, world view, what in your opinion are some of the ways in which, we can look at integrating the best way forward for India? And what would that entail? Not to sort of say that we want to sort of copy-paste what other countries are doing, but what are some of the best practices that India can look towards with respect to its own approach towards AI and copyright? So over to you.
Thank you so much, Jamila, and thank you for having me today. So interestingly, if you look at a rule-based TDM approach compared to maybe a fair use approach, the intention is actually completely opposite, because in a rule-based TDM approach, there is it's meant to be less intrusive, because then it's not really an entry barrier because there's no pervasive licensing requirement. It's also far more and therefore option for even a startup it's far more balanced in that sense. Therefore, the risk in adoption sort of a scenario is far lesser because there is that high level of ability. Also here, right holders can have mechanisms that they can, which can be machine readable opt-out mechanisms. And in such a TDM exception, you can have different degrees of exception. Like for example, for research and for scientific, anything which is in relation to maybe for more research-based purposes, there can be a far broader TDM exception, as opposed to if you are using something for commercially, then maybe there's a far more specific exception. So that's as opposed to like a fair use similar like in a scenario, because it's very fact-based. there's a high threshold, at least there's a high cost aspect of it from the person who's adopting also, because they spend a lot of resources in determining whether they're meeting that fair use exception. Also, I would say that from a right holder's perspective, there's no opt-out mechanism per se, and it's, if they are looking to enforce, it's more of a, litigation's your only route to actually get this. So from that perspective, cost is also a little more higher. So I would think if India were, they should look more towards perhaps a TDM exception, which is making, because the Copyright Act, we have a provision in the Copyright Act which talks about exceptions to infringement. So if we are looking at a TDM like exception, I think Section 52 has a place for such an exception, and there can be that distinction of what is being used solely for the purpose of analysis as opposed to maybe substantial copying, and we should be able to reconcile it with the existing framework.
Thanks, Apurva. I think you very rightfully and comprehensively sort of mapped out the pros and cons of the two approaches, and how the two approaches also choose to balance the interest of the innovators while also looking at ways in which the creative right holders can also be protected in some sense, and some agency can be given to them with respect to how they choose their information to be utilized. And I think that allows me the perfect segue to come to you, Subodip, because you've been working with some of these companies and innovators who sort of have been developing AI, right? And in your experience, I'd like to understand, how are bigger companies, operationalizing some of these copyright compliance for purposes of AI training, etc. What are some of the best practices that they are already adopting with respect to data scraping, analysis, etc. And the kind of, where do you see the biggest compliance gaps going forward with respect to, like, say, an approach that India is to take, and how it's going to impact the innovation landscape in the country, both from a bigger company perspective but also from a startup perspective, because a lot of startups are also thriving on the ability to draw data and to train on it. So what are your views on that?
Thanks, Jamila, and thanks to Dialogue and BIF for putting together this critical discussion, especially as in the last few weeks we have seen the AI governance guidelines report coming out. The DPDP rules, of course, have been announced. I think one thing to factor in is, as these governance guidelines did come out, and while they are looking at the more light touch principles based approach, one thing to factor in is that the report itself also talks about the fact that for certain areas such as AI and copyright, for the interplay of AI and data protection, for synthetically generated data, the adaptation of existing legal frameworks provides the pathway for it, rather than looking to create or make something new. And I completely agree with Apurva that Section 52, in terms of how fair dealing is providing a prescription, which is not about providing a negative prescription, right, but providing a class of exceptions around literary review, how you report current events. There is a case for looking at how AI models can provide for analytical transformation of data there, right? So the conversation which has taken place over the summer, when as we are all aware that the DPIIT constituted committee which is looking into this, and the key thing to keep in mind is they're not looking at a legislative proposal straight off the bat, but putting together a working paper that really provides a sense of an approach that we should be considering. In terms of how the conversation that we have seen with larger tech companies and how they, I think there's there is a need that even as we think about opt-out mechanisms, it needs to be seen that there is the right technical infrastructure or ecosystem around it that can set the guardrails for it, right? One such illustration I would certainly consider, and especially for larger companies, where we must keep in mind that governance is something that might be more of a cost center for the startups. And as India looks at backing its own domain-specific LLMs, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more about it in the road to the AI summit as well. there is a need to factor in that it's only the larger companies for whom that governance mechanisms in terms of, whether it's provenance trackers or model cards, those would be some of the systems that the larger companies would be at ease to look at its moat rather than for the startups, right? One thing to factor in as far as opt-out and the technical infrastructure around it, there needs to be that ecosystem of machine-readable prescribed infrastructure for us to, before we first talk about doing anything in a hard-nosed step. There is, of course, institutions such as the IETF, the World Wide Web Consortium, which are looking at this as the sort of the standards-led discussion around it. And it's important for India to be integrated in those mechanisms and then consider a calibrated approach as to how we proceed with our approach to looking at the AI and copyright intersection. So I think those would be just some of my sort of initial thoughts as far as where we should at least start the conversation, and we certainly hope that when this report does come out, there would be a process for industry startups to really have that consultation and dialogue around how do we ensure that the best calibrated approach is taken forward on AI and copyright, and what could be the broad a reasonable broad-based TDM exception that can be carved out in the Indian context.
Right. Interesting that you mentioned this, because a lot of what we've been discussing in the ecosystem also as think tanks, as civil society folks, is also to understand what could be the fine line that we can draw between the whole idea of legitimate data analysis and ways in which we can sort of imbibe best practices around TDMs and opt-outs, and I think Apurva also mentioned something around machine readable opt-outs, because that becomes very, very important, and the best practices that we are seeing grow globally also. We have something called robot.txt. I think some companies are also starting to look at ways in which they can also manage this kind of data scraping practices. So I think on this point, Apurva, I'd like to sort of bring you back into the conversation to understand, we've been seeing in the US, UK and other countries, there are a lot of litigations ongoing right now that are trying to understand and differentiate between unlicensed scraping as well as training on copyrighted works and what that amounts. Is it transformative? Is it fair use or not, right? So in the Indian law, and as we currently stand, I think Subhadeep also mentioned that the recent AI governance guidelines report also talks about, looking at current laws to sort of bring them up to speed to the developments that we're seeing in the technology space as well. So on that front, I'd like to understand, how should Indian law sort of conceptualize the boundary between legitimate data analysis and impermissible appropriation? I think a lot of this will be around some of the points you mentioned, but I'd like you to sort of explain that a little more detail, just for the interest of everyone. Yeah,
sure. So, if you look at the copyright legislation, the way it is set out, there is broadly the legislation of course identifies which are the classes of work which get protection and what are the rights which are there in relation to each of these. I think some of the rights which typically get discussed in the AI context is storing the material storing in any material form, including in an electronic means, or communicating the work in public. These are some of the rights which typically are spoken about. Now, in this context, just to give you a little bit, the Copyright Act has been an evolving legislation, and they've, for example, when there was exceptions under 52(1)(b) and (c), which was brought in for transient and incidental usage of work, specifically addressing internet service providers and aggregators, right? So in that context also, though there was storage of material, it was considered to be an exception to infringement. In that context, if we look at how large language models are consuming content, like material in which copyright may subsist, I think it's relevant to balance what the right is and what is the intended purpose. If the intended purpose is analysis, which is non-substantial copying, if the intended purpose is learning from, let's say, trends which is seen in the content, then it's not really impinging upon, and it may be argued that it's not really impinging upon the right holders right, because that's not, and therefore the argument of it being transformative in nature, because that's not the intended purpose of that content. Like, if an artistic work or a literary work is being consumed in a certain fashion and has been consistently be consumed in that fashion, for you to be able to identify, use that content entirely from an analysis standpoint, where maybe the usage is entirely transient or incidental, and the output has no resemblance to the input data. Those are the guardrails, right? Like, to say that there is not this excessive copying that's happening or reproduction, and that's where you would have enforcement, of course. But to the extent that it's not, then that's the balance, I think. So even when you're looking at an exception for infringement, it would have to set out as to what extent and what purpose that you're intending to use, and how the right of the right holder, if you're from the perspective of section 14 of the copyright, is getting balanced with the exception under section 52, which is how it has been done in the past as well, specifically for transient and incidental usage as well, for internet service providers, for aggregators. So maybe that's, there is some guidance to be taken from previous such mechanisms which have been adopted, and it also helps in balancing, the rights of the creator as well, because that was the intended purpose of the Copyright Act even, originally.
I think very interesting, I think, because you mentioned something on the lines of the idea expression dichotomy that we also keep talking about within the broader ambit of the copyright law, right? And how the copyright law protects only the expression of ideas and not necessarily the ideas itself, right? And this is just one line of argument to say that if the machine is only trying to analyze your data to learn from it in that sense, then it's not so much an infringement of copyright, but of course that's a line of argument to make, and there's a lot we can talk about on that as well. But we now have Aditi, who sort of joined us for the panel. Welcome, Aditi. I'd like to sort of now bring you into the discussion, right? Just from the vantage point of a media and a creative industry professional, I'd like to understand what are the most immediate opportunities as well as the risks that you see with the deployment of generative AI and across different spaces of like creative production, industries now picking up, news production, etc. So you've been working in that space. Just want to understand what challenges and what opportunities do you see, and what way forward would you sort of look at when you talk about some of these risks and challenges? Yeah.
Thank you, Jamila, and my sincere apologies for being late. I'm really sorry about that, but getting right into it, first of all, I will talk from my perspective as a journalist, both in terms of what I report on, as well as the risks and opportunities I see personally. Because earlier I was with a publication, like multiple publications. Now I have my own newsletter, I'm freelancing. So some of the risks, opportunities, recognizing that my perspective has also changed. So in terms of, first of all, opportunities. One is, of course, it makes your life easier in terms of SEO. So coming up with SEO headlines, SEO descriptions, because honestly, that is one of the, as a journalist, as someone who does a lot of primary reporting or does a lot of analytical reporting, I find it very, very hard to come up with SEO headlines and SEO slugs, as they are called. So that is where it's pretty useful. But at the same time, you run the risk of having very banal headlines and descriptions. The second place where it's good, at least when I have my own newsletter, therefore I don't have a staff at my disposal to do all this for me, is graphics generation or image generation. That's where it's very, very useful. But that's the extent to which I have personally used it in my work. Because I personally think the risks outweigh these opportunities. If you are a big publication, you will have graphic designers on your payroll. Give them that work. If you are a big publication, hire freelancers to do the graphic designing. I don't earn through my newsletter, therefore I cannot afford to pay a graphic designer. So that way it has a certain democratizing effect, but of course it's then taking away viable job opportunities from someone who may have earned maybe not what they deserved to earn, but something which is of course greater than zero. Now in terms of risk, number one is the overpromise of AI. A lot of people do not understand what is it that generative AI does, how it works, and what are the pitfalls for it. of it. So let's say 25 years ago, 20 years ago, you used to have Wikipedia journalists who would be derided for using Wikipedia as a source of information. Today, over the next couple of years, we will see people who are relying on Gen AI for research being derided the same way. Because it is true that generative AI is going to have an impact on journalism, but not in the way it's played out. I'll give you how it will affect. It's not going to take away jobs of people like me who do primary reporting. What is going to happen is that my salary is going to shrink substantially. So basically, in a publication, you have reporters who do primary reporting. That could involve talking to, say, bureaucrats, companies, going on the streets and talking to people. If an incident occurs, talking to people on the ground that, hey, what did you see happen? Trying to get CCTV footage from, say, the police, from the shopkeepers, etc. That is something AI cannot do. People are not going to talk to ChatGPT. ChatGPT suddenly cannot embody a physical body and go up to, say, Delhi police that, hey, give us the CCTV footage of what happened near Red Fort on 10th November. That's not going to happen. What's going to happen is that, let's say, a journalist reports that, hey, this was the sequence of events. They have published it on their publication's website, on their news channel, wherever. Then there will be, within that big organization, an entire online team which will run 5 to 10 copies of the same story. And there the wording will change just a little bit. That job has become much easier with Gen AI. You feed your own publication's article into the system, it will churn out a different copy. So I would argue it's self-plagiarism because the original reporter does not get the byline. That is one. Second, someone else who hasn't got the information, the desk in another publication, in another channel, will also regurgitate this information. Now, this kind of regurgitation forms the bulk of the news internet right now. And those who can game the SEO system the best are the ones who rank the highest. They are the ones who get the ad revenue because of the clicks. Now, as a result of AI, creating this kind of bulk, this kind of slop, has become much, much, much easier. So whereas earlier someone would still have to apply their brain to perhaps condense a 500-word article into 350 words, change a few words here or there, now you put it into, say, ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, whatever you may want to use, and say, hey, compress this into 350 words. That's it. I've had it happen to my articles, I've had it happen to my colleagues' articles. Now, as a result of that, the people whom you need for, say, the online desk, or these are not editors per se, but these are people whose job is to keep the website alive. And keeping the website alive because of SEO gaming is a pretty hard thing to do, and it's a necessary thing to do because of the problems related to revenue sharing, say, between Facebook, Google on the one hand, and news publishers on the other. So you don't, say, earlier you might need 20 people on the desk, now you might need, say, maybe 2. Now when you have that, fine, you're saving on the salaries of those 18 people, but at the same time, there is so much slop generation that's happening that the clicks will eventually fall through. Also, when you have AI summaries on the Google search result, this is a fairly erudite and technical audience. We would want to get into the nitty-gritty of everything. Section 8, subsection 1, subsection J of RTI Act, we will talk in those terms. 99% of the population does not consume news or law that way. For them, that AI summary suffices. So your click-through rates completely bottom out, and where is that AI summary being generated from? Either from the original article or from this bulk of the slop. So reporters don't disappear. People aren't just reading their articles as much as they would otherwise, so their salaries shrink. And that makes reporting as such harder. Because when you don't have those monetary resources, how are you supposed to go, say, even within Delhi? How are you supposed to live in a city like Delhi? Delhi could be replaced with any city. You may want to go outside Delhi and report. And this is, of course, a very Delhi journalist perspective here, a fairly privileged perspective at that. All that gets significantly affected. So the downstream reporting becomes much, much easier, as a result of which your primary reporting suffers eventually. So
Right, Aditi, I think you've explained at length of how this is playing out in the media industry, and I'd actually want to sort of throw a question back at you again, just in terms of understanding, now that you've sort of put out the worldview, right? What recommendations, according to you, should the Indian policymakers keep in mind when they look at sort of, rewiring this entire AI and copyright, intersection in terms of, the overall of the copyright law that is currently happening through the DPIIT recommendations that are to come out anytime now. So what recommendations would you want to sort of put forward in terms of just ensuring that balance of protecting innovation while also sort of looking at creative right holders' interests?
So there I would want to make two recommendations primarily. First, going back to the intent of the Copyright Act. I think Apurva talked about it already. But the intent is to reward the author for their work. In case of news, it's hard because facts are not copyrightable, but expression is. And it is often the expression that is reproduced by the Gen AI models. And I was going through the judgment, the UK judgment in the Getty versus Stability AI case, where the argument is that because the copy of the Getty image or the Getty product does not exist in the model, therefore it is not copyright infringement. And Apurva, please correct me in case I misinterpreted something, because I'm not a lawyer. And that, at least in my personal opinion, defeats the entire purpose of the copyright regime. Because fine, maybe in the letter of the law there is no copy, but in the spirit of the law we know what is happening. Where on the one hand we want to punish, say, someone like a LibGen or say someone like Anna's Archive for making these materials available for free. On the other hand, we are okay with big tech not adequately compensating the creators of all this content, news or creative content, whatever it may be. So the first thing I would say is that figure out what the intent of the intellectual property rights regime actually is. Is it to protect big tech interests, or is it to inculcate more creativity, more innovation? And innovation, not creativity, not so much as creativity, but innovation at the cost of whom? That is a question that policymakers genuinely need to answer. Second is that let's not repeat the mistakes that we made with news and SEO. Revenue sharing when it comes to, say, social media platforms such as Facebook or search engines such as Google. There is no doubt about the fact that they are the gatekeepers to information. If I were to ask people what is internet today, most lay people will say it's Google. That is literally the gate through which we access internet. They will not be even able to name another search engine. So that gatekeeping means that they are basically the troll on the bridge who will exact a gold coin from you for prioritizing your content. And that kind of revenue we did not go into that whole revenue sharing thing when social media was taking off. We still have not gone into it. But I think with the Gen AI thing, especially when it's being used both at the training stage and at the output stage, there is need to revenue share. And I personally don't buy the argument that this kind of revenue sharing, figuring out what to pay, whom to pay, how much to pay, what to pay, etc. I personally don't buy it. We are doing micropayments for YouTube and Twitter for different influencers depending on the number of impressions they get. We can certainly figure this out if there is enough of an intention. So.
Nice. Interesting arguments for sure, and a perspective that needs to sort of be taken into account when we look at this overall that we are currently undergoing with the copyright law. Subhadeep, I'd like to sort of bring you back into the conversation, and there is a lot that's already happening with respect to the DPIIT now looking into the revision of the act, and now the AI governance guidelines report also putting out mechanisms around transparency and also broader principles around how like a soft law approach to AI regulation can be adopted by India to further the cause of Viksit Bharat and the innovation spurge that we want to sort of the country to flourish into, right? But you know, in that backdrop, I'd like to understand from you, how are all of this sort of reshaping the commercial incentives and the risk appetites of some of these bigger companies, and what are some of the governance levers that are already being adopted by some of these companies to ensure that they are on track and they look at you know, these governance levers as a way to sort of have a strategic advantage and not so much wait for, like, you know, a law to sort of, you know, bring them back into you know, the right ways of operating. So, you know, around say like data scraping, if there are any best practices that are being adopted by companies to sort of understand you know, how the creators can also, their rights can also be best protected. So what is it that companies are already doing, and what is it, of course, a lot more that they can do in the times to come?
Sure. So I think on that, Jamila, I mean, there are 2-3 strands of discussion that we have seen with industry, especially given the process over the last 6 months with the DPIIT committee. One is, I think even the larger companies more, as much as, you know, other stakeholder segments, would appreciate the regulatory certainty to emerge from this process, right? In terms of what should we be looking at the training data set, what should we be looking at the output stages, what kinds of transparency mechanism should there be, disclosure requirements around data sets. I think there has been a case in a California state law where they've looked at a generative AI disclosure legislative proposal. So that's one. The other thing I would say is, you know, since Aditi was mentioning about the news context also, just in the larger creative industry context and what we have seen in industry conversations there is at least an appreciation of the fact that besides the whole aspect of revenue sharing arrangements, that there can be a larger sense of collaboration to also look at in terms of, let's say, you know, AI assisted dubbing for artists, for example, right? So if you're talking about, I'm going to the entire stream of multimodal outputs that are generated. It could be even in the form of you know, music companions for artists. So those are definitely some of the mechanisms to really talk about in terms of what could be the collaborative partnership models between content creators and the creative industry economy. The other aspect is also in terms of looking at what stage do we need the interventions, in terms of at the output level interventions. I think there is definitely a problematic case for us, you know, any sort of digital replicas of images and videos and other aspects which can be a clear case of infringement. So what should we be the more targeted intervention or mechanism to look at the output level? I think that is an important consideration. And going back, I do want to share that, you know, the intent of section 52, and given that does provide the pathway to look at what we do with you know, balancing AI innovation and copyright. The idea was that always to have 52 as a balance between the right of the copyright holder as well as enriching the public domain, right? And so even as India looks at you know, I think for the government of India, the moat is really in terms of looking at how it sort of enriches around you know, AI Quotient data sets platform, how these new LLM models evolve. So finding or striking that right balance would be important, and 52 with its intent and purpose has been you know, drafted with that purpose, and thereby that fair dealing as it extends to fair use, how it shapes up to provide that, and keeping these guardrails or risks in mind, especially in terms of any output level harms are concerned, would be an important consideration in terms of what sort of you know, governance approaches evolve from this process.
Thanks, Subhadeep. Yeah, I think we are all waiting with bated breath to understand what the DPIIT recommendations look like, because now with the AI governance guidelines report out, we are seeing that the government is taking a more calibrated approach towards understanding, how current laws can be brought up to speed, and also, what ways can we sort of imbibe to ensure that the innovation landscape in the country does not suffer, right? So I think that is a sentiment that's running across boards right now in terms of just understanding. But Apurva, back to you now. We've been talking about how there's need for more certainty, and I think that was the first response that you also gave. But with everything that's happening right now in the Indian landscape and also globally, looking forward, like going ahead, what according to you is the right way for India to sort of proceed? Do you think that there needs to be clarity brought about in the Indian copyright law with how innovators choose to use information, copyrighted information, so to say? Do you think there should be interpretive guidelines or any law instruments that can help them guide better? Should there be case by case analysis, or legal cases that help us steer the path forward, with similar to what we've seen in the US also, right, around the fair use doctrines, interpretation, etc. So what or a mix of some of these, right? So what according to you is the right way forward to give that clarity to the Indian landscape, to ensure that we are sort of on the right way, so as to give them better understanding of how they can choose to engage with these laws, but also continue to innovate more? And I think this will impact how India also chooses to sort of grow in the innovation landscape that we're currently standing on. So just your thoughts on that.
So, thank you so much. So, I think the point that even Aditi made gets addressed if scope and access, which is your two things that need to be balanced very clearly, right? What's the scope of use? How is the access being done? So, therefore, if you're looking at a framework, I would think that so while a fair dealing and a fair use sort of a mechanism is far more liberal in terms of usage, and it's far more flexible in terms of innovation, there is that factor that the risk associated with it is significantly higher, right? And it does result in multiplication of litigation. Therefore, if you're looking at a uniform approach which provides a good base for innovators, I would think maybe a TDM-like exception works better. And like I said, the TDM-like exception has to be staggered. Of course, there are purposes like scientific research, or maybe use for a particular purpose, where there may be a broader exception which may be granted. However, for commercial usage, the exception may be kept specific to the intent. Like, the idea is not, of course, to check everything, but the idea is to ensure that the purpose is getting met. And similarly, even for commercial use, there may also be a mechanism that you may want to adopt in terms of certain access, where you may want like a backstop where maybe there is a path to a licensing, like collective licensing or something like that. And these are, I would say that because it's not one rule fits all, a staggered approach in this nature would be I would say that that's the most ideal approach, because then it addresses maybe various usages, various stakeholders, and yet it also balances the right holders' intent as well. And of course, the innovators also need to be kept in mind, right? Even in terms of the person who is maybe innovating in the AI space, you want to be able to provide them also some level of clarity and certainty in terms of what they're doing, because not everyone wants to walk into a copyright suit. So therefore, if you have a TDM-like exception, then from an innovator's perspective also, they have like a clear guideline on how adoption has to be carried out, rather than trying to figure out whether fair dealing, because fair dealing and fair use are not entirely identical. They're quite different in scope. So therefore, maybe what works in the US may not work exactly in India, right? Because the scope of our fair dealing is maybe far different from what their fair use is. So from that context, I would think that a TDM-like approach, it benefits both the innovators and the people who are adopting the technology as well.
And I think, of course, there is an understanding around how that TDM is going to play out, as you rightfully mentioned, and what opt-outs could look like, right? What could be the balancing factor between ensuring that you're giving clarity to the ecosystem around innovation, but also ensuring that the rights of creative industry holders are also sort of, looked at, and they're also given the agency to sort of, decide in that sense, right? And I think that's an important point for us also to look at how that plays out in the long run is something for all of us to see and understand. But Aditi, back to you now. You mentioned something around the lines of how, with now AI being brought into the domain, a lot of times the right person whose credit is due is not given the due for it, right? So just on that thought, I'd like to pick your brains on understanding, how do you think AI generated or AI assisted content should be labeled or disclosed in a manner to sort of, ensure that the audiences know about the editorial integrity and facets of whose credit is really due. And I think this is something that the recent IT rules amendment also sort of looks into, right? So, what according to you could be the right ways to sort of look at that, and what kinds of industry norms or self-regulatory mechanisms, in addition to whatever we're talking about in the copyright law and a formal mechanism of, amending the law, etc. What other ways do you see the industry can adopt to sort of better ensure that the interest of everybody is protected as we move forward in this innovation drive?
That's an interesting question. Before I answer that, can I ask Apurva about collective licensing, if that's okay, if we have the time? Like
We
how
do have 10 minutes, but Apurva, if you can make your response pretty quick.
So the idea is to maybe provide a mechanism if someone has maybe large data sets and they want to offer, you may not want to opt out entirely, but you may want to provide a pathway for someone to maybe seek a licensing for the data set in order for training their AI model. That's one of the approaches. As to, rather than saying either you're in or out, you provide a mid ground where you may be able to monetize on it as well.
Oh, so collective licensing is like data set collectively, say, from a particular publication versus a bunch of publications getting together and collectively
You could do it that way as well. For
Okay.
example, you could, it could also be a mechanism where you agree to a certain licensing model as a community also, right? You basically opt into a certain licensing model as well, which may be commercial, which may not be commercial. Like it may not be monetarily commercial. It may also be in the nature of what is the intended purpose for it. For example, what's the intended output that I would say that both monetary and non-monetary as well. But you have some sort of governance around how the data gets used then.
Got it. So basically the data owner or the data creator has greater control in terms of how, say, an OpenAI or a Google are using that data.
Correct. Yeah, but then it's also relevant to know what is the kind of data, right? But this is effectively the kind of data that you're looking at, which is perhaps not entirely replaceable. For example, if you were to use let me try and find a better example, I think.
But maybe,
sorry.
maybe you guys can take
Okay,
this
okay.
off because we have just 5 minutes. Maybe, Aditi,
sorry.
back to
The
you.
reason I asked about collective licensing in particular is related to the question that you asked. For instance, how do you reveal about editorial integrity? I think when we're talking about labeling as the IT ministry intended it, and when we're talking about editorial integrity, these are two different questions. When we're talking about editorial integrity, we have a greater expectation from a news publication, from a news channel, than say from someone who's creating reels on Instagram about frolicking through Connaught Place. I don't know, that's just a random example. Or a stand-up comic. So the expectation is very different. There then it becomes very, very clear that if you are in the business and or professional activity of reporting news, and this is where it gets into murky territory because of IT rules, broadcasting bill, that what exactly journalism is, what exactly news and current affairs is. But essentially, if you are trying to inform people about what's happening right now, either through what you have done yourself, the reporting you've done yourself, gone out and asked people or looked at the documents yourself, or you're relying on someone and relaying that information, then you have to have disclosures in place. So for instance, and that's the one advantage of being a journalist, I can take names, I don't have to worry about contracts. So the Times Group extensively uses AI to generate their graphics in Times of India and Economic Times. Yet disclosures are not always there that these are AI generated. The least we expect from a newspaper that we read every day is disclose that it's AI generated. So what you expect from a Times of India versus a Delhi Times is different, but still a Delhi Times has a higher threshold than say maybe a Pink Pill. So we have to, these are things we all know, those don't necessarily need to be codified. And that is where the self-regulatory part of it needs to come in, that instead of always trying to look for the loophole to evade any kind of accountability as well as legal liability, we need to take ownership over our own work, both as journalists and as creative individuals, as well as media owners. So that is where it's very important that news publications, news channels always have labels that hey, this was AI generated. The question that has often come up in debates around, in any discussion around the IT rule proposed amendments about synthetically generated information is that at what stage do you want this to kick in? So for instance, if I have an image, I take a photograph of the air pollution at India Gate. Now I'm using some kind of a tool, maybe Photoshop, maybe even PowerPoint does that, to increase or decrease the brightness. Do I then declare that it's synthetically generated or some kind of software tool has been used to enhance the image? Arguably not. And that is where the editorial discretion, at least in terms, actually I wouldn't say discretion, editorial maturity should kick in, that hey, our readers or our viewers need to know that this is not generated by a human, or this has been enhanced in a way which may lead to misleading perceptions. And that is where honestly editors need to be held to account, especially news channel editors. That hey, boss, you can't be always saying, oh no, the law doesn't say this. Let's, as journalists, we are doing something that that perhaps say a stand-up comic on YouTube is not doing. Let's be responsible. Now, on self-regulation, I personally think this needs to be self-regulation. I don't think the government should. I don't think the government should be getting into this, because I will again talk about it from the perspective of news in particular. The government has no business telling people what news is and what news is not, because most of news is about holding government to account. So if the government gets into the business of saying that hey, you need to label this, you need to label that, especially for journalists, it's a slippery slope. That shouldn't happen. Now on the question of creative side, so if you're using AI, say for instance to show a superhero jumping off a roof, etc. We have been seeing CGI for a number of years, for like 50, 60 years. We have been seeing VFX. None of us think that we can jump off a 20-floor building and survive. So we don't necessarily need to be disclosed in a Shah Rukh Khan movie that hey, you can't jump off a mountain dressed like a mummy and survive it. We don't need to know that. That also requires certain, there I would argue, more than the maturity or responsibility of the creator, it is the maturity and responsibility of the viewer as well. Let's treat our viewers, our audience, as adults. Even if they're not adults, they're children. Let the parents and guardians do the parenting. Let's not become a nanny state. We need to take a chill pill there, to be perfectly honest. So there I don't think those disclosures are required. Then comes the question of the user-generated content and AI slop. Do we need disclosures? Arguably, yes. That's a very hard one to say. For instance, if you have a video of, this is a video I saw yesterday, so it's on the top of my mind, where a deer is running towards a car and the woman immediately opens it and the deer jumps inside, and then you see a tiger coming and this woman has saved this deer from being eaten by a tiger. Of course it's AI. But the first time I saw it, I was like, wait, what? Can it even happen? And then I was like, of course it's AI. But not everybody will recognize it. It's just because I deal with these things day in, day out. Do we need a disclosure? I would say then, of course, if you're using Nano Banana or you're using ChatGPT or whatever tool you're using to do all this, I think watermarking there works. I think it's worth having. Question of text is another debate altogether. That hey, text can be easily copy pasted. What do? Do you have a Dawn-like situation where there is that hey, if you want something more, they carried that last paragraph. But I think disclosures can be made, and reasonableness again rely on the maturity of people to some extent.
Right. A lot of fun thoughts that I could pick on, but I think we have up with time. I don't know if we have time to take more questions also. But if you guys have any questions, feel free to catch the panelists off the panel and sort of, pick their brains on that. But thank you once again to my fellow panelists for this discussion. And thank you all for being a wonderful audience. Thank you.
So we'll have a group photograph, but before that, we have Rajiv sir from Nixie, who manages the .in domain for Nixie, and he's ex-AP TLD board member. We have the mementos ready. For Aditi Agarwal, she's a tech journalist. Mr. Shubhodeep Josh from the Asia Group. Miss Apurva Murli from Shardul Amarchandan Mangaldas. And Miss Jamila Sahiba who's very nicely knit this panel together from the dialogue. We'd request you all to just please be in the front, and with Rajiv sir you guys can all get a picture clicked, group photograph, and then we'll start with the next session, which is hosted by Digital Empowerment Foundation. Thanking all the speakers for making it such early on a foggy day. Thank you.
Hello, check. Hello, check. Hello, check one. Hello, check. Hello, check. Hello, check. Check 1 2. Hello, check. Hello, check. Hello, check. Hello, check. Hello, check. Hello, check. Hello, check.
We'll be starting the next session at 10:45.
चार नंबर वाला 4 नंबर हैंड भाई 1 नंबर पे हेलो चेक इसको कम कर थोड़ा हेलो चेक हेलो चेक हेलो चेक बस हेलो चेक, हेलो चेक, इसको थोड़ा कम कर दे, उधर वाला माइक, हेलो चेक, हेलो चेक, हेलो चेक, हेलो चेक, हेलो चेक, हेलो चेक, कर दिया मेरे भाई, कर दिया, हेलो चेक,
इसमें नहीं डाल रखा है, इसमें डाल रखा है।
हेलो चेक, 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 हेलो हेलो चेक, ठीक है।
इसमें नहीं है भाई, मैंने तेरे पास लिंक शेयर किया, लिंक
ब्रो दिस इज नॉट माय लैपटॉप।
इसमें नहीं है वो,
क्यों नहीं है?
फोल्डर में है।
कैन यू जस्ट ये हटा दो अभी। ये प्रियंका को भेज, प्रियंका को भेज। वीडियो कौन सी प्ले करनी है?
हाँ तू कर ऑन कर।
इसको पता होगा सर, ये वो है। भेज, प्रियंका को भेजना।
प्रियंका के पास,
प्रियंका का है।
shape global dialogues. And we have our young and dynamic Udisha, who is, of course, a journalist first, and as youth, she is also youth ambassador for Internet Society. So she will be able to share a lot of reflections on what is the role of youth in today's digital ecosystem. And Shashank, thank you so much for joining us. Shashank is Associate Director at Center for Communication Governance, which is affiliated with NLU Delhi. And when we talk about policy, when we talk about regulatory frameworks, CCG plays a very crucial role in defining them and in consultation with a lot of stakeholders, diverse stakeholders. So with your permission, I will play a small short film, which is, it's a 6-minute short film. It will set the context of our conversation, because we are going to talk about the idea of a self-sustainable smart village, because we are generally always talking about smart cities. So this is basically Dhachula. It's a place in Uttarakhand. It's a disaster-prone mountainous region. And when we talk about last mile, we are talking about last mile connectivity in regions where internet is still, the questions are quite basic in terms of access to internet. So this program was supported by Internet Society Foundation, and DEF has been the implementing partner. So I request Jasbir to play.
Yeah, that's a very nice video. I've seen it. And it forwarded it actually. Very well made.
पहाड़ों में लाइट सीधी नहीं, छोटी मोटी चीजों के लिए ना तरसना पड़ता है। बारिश के टाइम यहाँ पहाड़ गिरने के बहुत सारे चांसेस होते हैं, कईयों की मौत भी हो जाती है इस टाइम। When we first came here, we identified few things. These are almost like information dark zones. Nobody knows what information they should have to make their life better. And this region is very disaster prone. I am Nada Fatima. I work with Digital Empowerment Foundation as a program manager. बचपन से स्ट्रगल देखा है चीज़ों के लिए ना, बहुत खाने पीने से रिलेटेड, एजुकेशन से रिलेटेड, मतलब कंफर्म ही नहीं है कि आगे भी सही होगा। मेरा नाम मानसी खान है, मैं सिखा गाँव से। हम चाहते हैं जहाँ हम रहे वहाँ चीज़ें आए, जो हमने फेस किया ना वो आने वाले लोग ना फेस करें। Sadly, nobody has come to these regions to solve the issues that is prominent here with the people and the community. DF as an organization thought, as the initial step, identified 10 different villages which are more prone to disaster, landslides and all of those things, and identify the local people within the villages only who can take up that entrepreneurship responsibility, but also act as a medium during disaster.
मेरा नाम आमिर रहमान है, मैं डिजिटल एम्पावरमेंट में एज अ प्रोजेक्ट मैनेजर वर्क करता हूँ। डिजास्टर का यहाँ पे कुछ फिक्स नहीं है कि कब आ जाए, इतनी बुरी हालत है कनेक्टिविटी। तो फिर हमने जितने भी पॉसिबिलिटीज हम लोग कर सकते थे, हमने वो सारे ट्राई किए हैं। यहाँ नया रिसर्च करके बनाया कि कैसे इंसानों को आपस में कनेक्ट कर सकते हैं जो कम्युनिकेशन मोड अनब्रेकेबल। सबसे पहले तो हमने 10 अलग अलग लोकेशन पे सेंटर अपने स्टार्ट किए हैं। 10 हमने इंटरनेट कहीं से किसी भी अरेंजमेंट किया, उसके सेंटर्स पे हमने वो सारी सेटअप किए। हमारे पास एक डिवाइस हमने आइडेंटिफाई किया जिसको बोलते हम लोग मोबाइल बूस्टर डिवाइस। तो जहाँ पे अगर मुझे थोड़ा सा भी इंटरनेट मिल जाता है ना, वो उसको बूस्ट कर देते हैं अपने चिप की वजह से। जहाँ पे हमारे पास कुछ भी नहीं था, नेटवर्क नहीं, कोई ऑप्शंस नहीं, वहां पे हम सैटेलाइट इंटरनेट पे गए। जहाँ पे थोड़ा बहुत ऑप्शन था, वहाँ हमने पॉइंट टू पॉइंट लिंक बना के उसको ओवर वायरलेस हमने उसे कनेक्ट कर दिया। अभी हमारे 10 के 10 सेंटर टोटली वायरलेस से कनेक्टेड है। अगर डिजास्टर होता है तो कम्युनिकेशन नहीं छूटनी चाहिए।
हेलो 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 हेलो, आवाज आ रही मेरी? इससे मैं वर्कशॉप बोल रही हूँ। सुबह काफी तेज बारिश होने की वजह से रास्ता थोड़ा बंद हो चुका है। सारा मलबा रोड में आ चुका है और पत्थरें भी हो रखी है। आप लोग जो भी गाड़ी या कोई भी लोग जो इस रास्ते से आ रहे, उन्हें बोलिए कि 1-2 घंटे तक ना आए।
अब कम्युनिटी को पता चल गया है कि अगर उनको बाहर कहीं कनेक्ट करना है तो वो कहाँ से कर सकते हैं। तो वो तुरंत इंफॉर्मेशन हमारे सेंटर तक पहुंचाते हैं, हमारे सेंटर से वो फ्लो करता है। इस सेंटर से बहुत लोगों को ना अब फायदा मिलता है।
बड़ी ही आपकी वजह से लोगों को एक आशा मिली कि हाँ अब चीजें अच्छी होंगी। मैं सोचना पहली हूँ, मुझे इस बात की बहुत ज्यादा खुशी कि मैं अपने गाँव के लिए कुछ कर पा रही हूँ। जो आजकल नई नई चीजें हो रही हैं, उस चीज के बारे में हम बताते हैं लोगों को। पैन कार्ड, आधार कार्ड, बहुत लोगों को ये चीज बनाना है ये भी पता नहीं था।
Those 10 Suchnapreneurs or information agents, they have been trained and groomed in a way from wherein they provide services to the community and they take minimum charges from the community members so that they are able to maintain a revenue for themselves.
सामुदायिक केंद्र में इतनी सुविधा है, हमें यही सुविधा चाहिए। आधार कार्ड बनवाने हैं, जो नए पेंशन बनवाने हैं, पैन कार्ड बनवाने हैं, स्वास्थ्य कार्ड बनवाने हैं, यहाँ तक कि बच्चों का जन्म प्रमाण पत्र।
सबसे पहले तो ये होता था कि कोई भी सूचना हम तक पहुंचने में टाइम लगता था। सेंटर खुला था, हमारी भी बहुत हेल्प होती है। व्हाट्सएप ग्रुप बने हैं, विभाग के ग्रुप बने हैं, तो सूचना जैसे डालते हैं सबके पास पहुंच जाती है। हम काम भी ऐप में करते हैं, जैसे लोग इन करते हैं हम, अब हम ऐप में डालते हैं तो वो खुद ही बता देता है।
तो हमें जो बेस्ट मिला हमने उसको यहाँ पे इम्प्लीमेंट किया और कम्युनिटी भी उसको एक्सेप्ट कर। बच्चे अब ऑनलाइन जा रहे हैं, उनके पास खुद का फेसबुक इंस्टाग्राम अकाउंट है, वो पूरी दुनिया से कनेक्ट हो रहे हैं, एक्सप्लोर कर रहे हैं चीज़ों को। हमारे आने से एक बहुत चेंजेस कम्युनिटीज में भी। बेसिकली इंटरनेट इज लाइफ चेंजर फॉर देम।
मुझे अब खुशी होती है कि अब ये सुनने को नहीं मिलेगा ना कि मेरे गाँव में ये सब नहीं है, मेरे गाँव में भी सब चीज़ है।
Thank you. So, I mean, as this video suggests, right, we call it the Suchnapreneur model. It's a hub and spoke model. And this, we have actually traveled the same journey as Government of India in setting up common service centers. So, common service centers basically become those avenues in every state, you know, to enable access to e-governance. Suchnapreneur centers, CIRCs, they are in 2,400 locations now in the country, which not just you know, act as a platform for enabling e-governance, but also understanding and building hyper-local and decentralized approaches to how do you build functional digital literacy, how do you build critical digital literacy, how do you build media information literacy, and then how do you connect farmers, artisans, different kinds of communities to their markets, and ensure that this digital development becomes a model of entrepreneurship itself, right? It generates employment in the communities. So for every region in India, and India is so culturally diverse with so much like diversities cutting across castes, genders, religion, demographics. And yesterday I was in a panel on Northeast, talking about Northeast, and like what are those very specific challenges that each of these communities face, and how governments, CSOs, think tanks, policy makers are coming together to have these holistic conversations to build very contextual solutions. So that's where I think the conversation about smart villages is very important, because in India, if we see, there's a lot of migration to cities, and we see that as a developmental model, but it is not sustainable. Cities are all landlocked, and we see that even people are coming to the cities, it's not really empowering citizens, but more creating ghettos, communities, and it's not really changing the socioeconomic structures, right? And so we really feel like with these hub and spoke models rooted in communities, led by communities, we can create self-sustainable smart villages. And then this is a learning from 24 years of work that Digital Empowerment Foundation, along with the Government of India, has undertaken. And before I quickly go to the panelists, now we have started working with Department of Telecommunications. DOT has, under the leadership of Dr. Neeraj Mittal, has conceptualized the Samriddh Kendra Gram, and DEF has been the implementing partner. We have started working with DOT, and we use a new word to it. We say phygital. We don't just say digital. We say physical plus digital. A human-centered digital development plan rooted in communities will actually enable a people-centric DPI. So this is where I think I will start the conversation. So for DPIs to be really people-centric, community-centric, and therefore can make it a self-sustainable smart village model. And you come from Assam yourself, and I'm sure you have your own observations. So what are those barriers you see in today's context that could possibly hinder this development of self-sustainable smart villages?
Thanks. I think I'm audible. I'm quite loud, but yeah, I have to come like this close to it. Yeah, this is better. Yeah. So I think one of the things everyone, and even regulators needs, or decision makers needs to understand that one strategy will not work to connect the last mile people. It's not the same. It cannot be. You have to have different strokes for different folks, I would say. So and you have to have multiple approaches. Currently, if you look at it, if we want to connect the last mile, make things accessible to them the way it is for us, and that I would not just say a smartphone out there, connectivity there is internet there, but someone who can use it in a meaningful way, whichever makes sense for them. I think you have to adopt different approaches, and obviously look at it at a local level, and each place would be different, because private sector is not going there at this point of time, and I'm talking about those places which are not connected yet, not talking about the places where you have good ROI. So you have to incentivize also private sector to go, or look at multiple options of connecting them. It could be any of the options which you're talking of, or any other option, and incentivize them. For example, if I look at the way even the AGR was used, or you have the what do you call it, the USO funds have been used for so long, it had been only given to certain PSUs, etc. You have to from the government level, I think you need to be more creative in who can use it, who cannot use it, encourage private sector, even encourage, since you're sitting here, I'm saying DEF, but it could be any other organizations who are involved, even incentivize them. A civil society organization or a non-governmental or a PSU doesn't mean that they will not work. I think we have to be creative, have different kinds of technologies which come in. Many times we are fixated on certain technologies, but we should be technology agnostic to have that. And another thing is, it should not be that you are just implementing. Creating a small ecosystem at the local level, you also should see that when you withdraw your support, can it self-sustain? To do that, what are you doing? Are you building the capacity of the local people to sustain it? Are they seeing a business model there, or are they seeing development? As you rightly said, we are having a lot of migration to the cities. Look at the pollution level. We are not being able to cater to so many people, and we are a huge population. Are we giving the right kind of education at the rural areas? If we can't, is the online education the way? Yes, it is. Can they get that connectivity to get even those curriculum, or even, we were talking the other day of videos, IIT videos in local languages. Is it available to them? I think if you give those meaningful things to them and they see value, migrations will also stop. People don't migrate because they want to migrate to city. A labor doesn't come. The labor comes here because they see they can earn some money. But if they can earn the same kind of money sitting at home, why not? So I'll leave it at that at this point of time.
Okay, thank you, Amrita ji. So I think, because we spoke about the private sector, now when we talk about digital governance and even governance, data governance, and now with DPI, of course, like we need more regulations in place. Digital ecosystem is rapidly evolving. We as civil society keep chasing and, to understand it. And then it's much harder for communities and citizens who are already affected by a lot of social divides. Now, when we talk about private sector, they play a very key role in developing technologies, in enabling digital infrastructures, which also include the now booming data centers. So, and there are conversations always taking place, where governments are, they have binding regulations in place, policies in place to ensure the governance is ethical, secure, safe, open, citizen-centered. So, here, Shashank, the question is to you. What are those checks that we need to keep in mind always? And how do you see that trajectory evolving in India?
Thanks, Arpita, and thanks for inviting me to talk about community building and decentralized model of access, which I don't generally get to speak about. So thank you so much to DF. I'd like to sort of point to when we think about laws, and India's been trying really hard to make and craft laws that serve the marginalized communities, but I think there is some way to go, right? And I'll take two to three examples, right? If we look at the data protection law, right, and we look at the way children's data protection has been envisioned, right, there's heavy emphasis on parental consent, parental verification, and then use, right? I think that's important, but we have to start looking at the model that the laws recommends and whether that will work in India, right? Let's talk about local realities. In India, a lot of families have shared devices, for example, right? One device is shared between number of people, right? So then if a child is using an existing account of an adult, then what access points are we managing there, right? And how will this law work in that situation? Second of all, a lot of children in families are the ones who are, the next generation who are using sort of internet services, the innovative internet services, and teaching their elderly in the house to use them. So if children become the first point of access, how are we envisioning parental consent and parental oversight, right? So why I'm trying to point to these examples is that we're trying to solve a problem, but I'm not sure if it's deeply connected with realities of India. Another example I'll take, like recently, there was a lot of conversation about a deepfakes amendment in our IET rules, right? That asks generative AI companies to watermark or label content, and then social media companies to ensure that this content is labeled, or if it's harmful, then take it off, right? Now, if you look at the way the rule is constructed, it's very broadly defined, right? So does this mean that on one side we're encouraging people to use AI services, on one side we're confusing them that if you create if you take out a friend from an image, that might be sort of misinformation? I'm not saying that that's the intent of the law, but it's the indirect intent if the words remain so broad, right? And it causes confusion for even companies that, okay, what are we going to do, right? So I think why I'm pointing to these examples is that we know certain problems, we know we want to address them, but those solutions right now are not deeply connected to the way people use the internet, right? The last example I'll use is, for example, India is the hub for data annotation when we think about AI, right? If you look at the recent AI guidelines, there is no mention of those communities, right? So you talk about local communities, you think about bottom up approaches to governance. I think there is some way to go there. I'll just take a minute more. Unfortunately, and I'll stick to digital laws. I've been observing them for the past few years. I don't think we have a clear problem statement, and because we don't have a clear problem statement, the solutions that we're coming to are not connected deeply to India's experience of using the internet, right? And we don't do sufficient and meaningful consultation, right? Consultation with people's like communities you are speaking to. Are we talking to them? Are we learning from them? Are we seeing what they need? For example, we spent years crafting a data protection law, right? And millions of people submitted comments to the government, right? Suggestions, citizens suggested changes. We've not even seen one submission that the government has gotten on a data protection law, right? So when I say consultation, I see meaningful consultation, not just saying that here's the law, comment, and we don't even know where those comments went. Sorry, I'll stop there, but I'll come back and sort of address more things.
Thank you for your insights. Lot of thoughts, but like just quickly to touch upon, as of today, like yesterday, we were mentioning the same statistic reference that in India as of now, we have 940 or 950 million approx broadband users. And India is actually proudly also known for its largest number of smartphone users. But that actually does not translate probably into meaningful connectivity for a lot of people, especially because you spoke about ownership. Mobile ownership is very central to that. It's true that women in rural India are still, they don't have phones largely. And when we talk about, doing capacity building to bridge digital divide, we often tend to miss what are those social divides that are hindering digital, solving the problem for digital divide. Yesterday I took that example, I'll take it quickly here, that we have a digital Didi program which essentially talks about menstruation. And what we do is basically we start the conversation in a very all-women space about breaking taboos, about menstruation, and having dialogue with the men in the communities, and then slowly go towards digital literacy and capacity building. So when we talk about last mile communities, like you said, policies, frameworks, legal legislations. One, of course, the vagueness creates an issue because it doesn't clearly present as a problem statement, yes. And second is that last mile community, a citizen is a PWD person, is a woman, is a person from a demographically difficult region, and more. So definitely that is something, the meaningful consultation, then again, what you said. Here, Civis is one organization I would talk about who are definitely putting that effort of connecting citizens to all the legislations that are coming up. So they give advertisements on their website. They reach out to CSOs, think tanks, saying that, hey, this legislation is out for review. Please submit your reflections. So let's make more informed policy making. So such efforts definitely are a step towards meaningful consultation, but we need more. And I think to make it more meaningful, probably one of the steps is to make it more community informed, and that could be achieved partially through having more CSOs participate in conversations with government, with technologists, with policymakers. And okay, so coming to our youngest member on the panel, she's Youth Ambassador of Internet Society, and I actually met her in WSIS 20+ review in Geneva, where all these conversations, and not just from India, but across the world, informed the global dialogue on what Geneva Declaration in 2003 had envisioned, that we will have a more equitable digital world globally, and what are those challenges that remain today, especially for the global south, were discussed. And Udisha had led a very brilliant panel there representing India, and and the voices of the youth. So here I think I will come to you with this question that again when we talk about citizen communities, youth are also not a homogeneous community. Youth are also young girls, youth are young people who are not getting employment, youth are struggling people devoid of education, health, basic financial services. So please tell me the role of youth in today's digital ecosystem and how can local realities inform global conversations as well.
Thank you, Arpita, for this question. If we talk about the population of India, then I think young people comprise the largest population compared to any country. And if I could put out some data point, then 65% of India's population is under 35 years of age, which is a large demographic that we're talking about. Now, that's the data out there. But as you rightly pointed out, when we talk about youth, it's just young people who would be a certain age. But then if we boil it down, then you will have young women, young men, people from marginalized communities, those who do not identify as part of the heterogeneous community as well. Displaced population would be there. A youth coming from a sophisticated background in an urban society will be there. One from the rural part would be there. So there are a lot of dissections there. So definitely that is one thing we need to take into account when we are talking about young population and the representation. Now second, the changes, sort of the momentum that young people can bring to these conversations is one, exactly as Amrita ji talked about, you talked about through the video we saw. The need for representation comes because nobody understands the issue of a particular community better than someone who is coming from there, right? So if we talk about a village or a region which is dominantly relying on agriculture for their livelihood, now for that particular community, the challenges will be very, very different from a different community or a different region where people are relying on, let's say, making indigenous products or handlooms for their livelihood, right? So there has to be a difference in terms of how we train, enable them, and also provide the technologies to them. So the person from the rural background who is into the agricultural setup, there you would need a lot of, you would need to create a lot of efforts into, talking about the government schemes that are there. Drone Didi scheme, PM Kisan Yojana scheme, the subsidies that are available there, and how to create digital IDs for farmers. These are the areas you would need in that setup. But do you think all these metrics, all these points will work in the place where you have the community which is actually creating handlooms or some form of art? No. There you would need to talk about women entrepreneurship schemes, government schemes that are relevant for those communities to actually go onto these big e-com platforms and make the, sell their products, to be known, to actually further those art forms and what they are creating. So I think youth can play a very, very important role in actually customizing these sort of solutions and technologies and empower those communities. So here we are not just creating empowerment or sort of some financial aid for those who are working towards it, but also those who are part of the community, because you are actually enabling them. You are telling them this is how you create a website, this is how you click the pictures and upload them and sell them, this is how you manage the finances on your laptop or some tool that you use. So youth, I think, has a very good understanding, and again the point is, the underlining point is that they have to be part of that specific community. So that's one idea that I think that's there. Second, again, by the reason that somebody has grown into that place, grown up into that place, so they know how the ecosystem works, they know the challenges that are there, the opportunities that are there. So there they can be very, very influential because of definitely the trust factor that they have there. So I think because of these reasons, the role that young people can play is it's literally unparalleled. But again, there are some challenges there. For you to create a snowball effect, that you train one person, but then you want that one person to train 10 more. For that, there has to be continuous mentorship, training, capacity building that has to keep rolling on, so that there are no overnight successes that you can get anywhere. So for that, the momentum has to continue for a period of time to actually gauge that this is the difference that we brought to this community. This is how we've got meaningful connectivity in place. So that has to be there. Second, I think think young people, a lot of times, especially from the global south, we struggle with sort of incentives. And when Amrita ji also talked about it a bit, but when I say incentives in the context of young people, it does not necessarily need to be financial all the time. You'll have to create some policy framework where young people feel seen in terms of what they are doing, some sort of certification, visibility. Like, I'm the youth ambassador, and at this point for this year I'm representing India. Why can't we have the youth ambassadors and these digital ambassadors on a community level? They will feel more incentivized and sort of encouraged to take the steps that they are taking. So I think in a nutshell, this is the role that the youth can play here.
Very important point. Yes, Amrita ji. I was going to actually direct it to youth IGF and how you would react to it.
Yeah, just to add to it, there's another dimension. Youth can be anyone from the age of 18 to 35, and this whole range is huge, and it is very diverse. 18, you are in college. 20, 21, you are looking for jobs. 35, you may have had a job or something, so the requirements are different, so we need to understand it. Another thing which happens is the young people are going to use or are going to bear the brunt of the regulations which come out today. So, and in most of the times you will see they are represented in a very patronizing way. It happens with women also. Regulations for gender come up, maybe there may be no woman in the panel. So it's not anything which is new. It happens with people with, accessibility issues. So we are very good at judging for others or making rules for others. So I think, empowerment of the youth is important. Getting and you cannot have everyone also in the room. This is all, if you're saying we are multi-stakeholder, we represent everyone, you may be representing some people. So in that case, what I could, point to is last year during the Net Mundial discussions, there was this Sao Paulo guidelines for multi-stakeholder participation, which came out, which says that multi-stakeholderism is a way, but it's not 100% there. You can improve it, and there are various ways they say how you can engage communities, check how multi-stakeholder you are, etc. So it's a work in progress. But I think the youth IGF, for example, or others could be a place where people can come and discuss in open the issues. Now, many times when we want to even have the India IGF, we come up with this comment that it doesn't make regulations. क्या होता है इससे? ठीक है, यहाँ बात करके लोग चले जाते हैं. But the issue is, or I would say, there has to be some safe spaces where people can come and discuss things. What we feel, or even the young feel, are the issues, right? If you do not hear their voices, they don't have a place where they can come and discuss, even discuss, some perhaps best practices. How will that percolate up? Or even if governments use these platforms to say, look, this is how we are thinking, they can get more people to come and even speak in an open forum without a in a non-judgmental way that, look, this works, this doesn't. Taking Shashank's example of the children's verification, identification, yes, protecting children online is important. But today, it's the children who teaches the adults how to use or navigate the internet. When they go to school, are the teachers equipped to even train them on safe cyber hygiene? They are not. Even the teachers are not in the best of schools. Are we developing the capacity of those at home or in school on how they need to navigate the internet? Like, normally a kid learns how to cross the road. In India, we do it with jaywalk, but ki red light hai to ruk jao, green light hai, you have to move. Are we teaching them the safe hygiene or anything? So that is also important. In the rural areas, it's the farmer, if you have those kind of people who are incentivized to stay there, help the farmers, for example, in agriculture, etc., they get some money out of it, they will stay in those places and they will also work. There has to be incentives, as she said. There has to be opportunities for skill upgradation. But again, many times for certificates, people will say, if there is a conference, can I come? I'll get a certificate. That is also, there are both ways of it, but if you incentivize them, I think they would do it.
The discussions are, I think, self-led, and I don't think I need to summarize it, but I think one very important reflection is that youth from rural India especially have to be connected to the conversations that are taking place in urban cities. That is one. And here, okay, I will come back to the idea of a smart village here, taking all our conversations. Now, it opens up a little deeper issue, right? When we are talking about self-sustainable smart villages, we will need extended and expanded digital infrastructures. 15 minutes. Okay. We'll need extended and expanded digital infrastructures. Now for AI ecosystem to also thrive and boom and do all its wonders, we need more data centers. So, and these are all being set up in tier 3, tier 4 cities, in villages. And our research itself, like we are conducting one study to understand the socio-environmental implications of the rising data centers on the communities who are living in the vicinity. And we have visited so far 2 communities, and we see the extent to which water, land, the question of land, water and power consumption are huge crisis for all of us. And when we talk about community here, we don't necessarily have to think of community who live right near the city, near the data center. It is the entire state, because like for so much power consumption, for so much water allocation, everything is connected, and we are also as impacted. Our electricity at home, homes are also impacted. So it's not a conversation to be, it shouldn't happen in isolation. I think it's a conversation that we must have. If we really want villages to be smart, self-sustainable, digitally equipped, it's also coming at environmental costs and socio-environmental costs. And then first step is taking lands. And those lands which are basically being used for agriculture for decades, that is our backbone, right, of India. And we are letting our lands go for digital development. And then we are hoping that all the people who own these lands will get employed in those data centers, which is not necessarily the case because they're not skilled enough. It'll take another decade minimum for them to come on par, for education. So ultimately they might end up, maybe 5% of them might end up as sanitation workers or gardeners in the data centers. So again, when we are talking about self-sustainable smart village model, which is extremely crucial, and we can make it happen. Government of India, DEF, and many, I think, frameworks and organizations are working on it to how to enable a DPI powered e-governance model, But at the same time, it poses very deeper questions. Are we addressing those questions? And here, it's not just a local national conversation, it is a global conversation, because all of these big techs, Microsoft, AWS, and then many big tech who are opening data centers in the global south, right, are all housed in US, right? So then the conversations are as global, as important as global and as national. So that's why we, again, like how we use phygital, we also use the word glocal. So how do we have local conversations about it, which is informed by local realities and informs that global dialogue and reflects our realities from the global south. So here, this would be our closing round, where please, from your perspective, because you have played a very good, important role in VISIS dialogues, please tell me how to go about it.
So we can't solve this issue, but it's a challenging one. On one hand, you want to develop your capability in the technology race, because if you are left behind, you are behind. Studies show that if you are, the tech divide is also increasing. So, and every country wants to grow. So you, on one hand, you want data centers. On another hand, you want to ensure sustainability. I would talk about it in sustainability ways. So how do you do that? And the conversation below, just before this panel, was something on that how do you make things sustainable? Because this is going to happen. You can't stop it. Agricultural land has gone earlier also. When you see the cities extending, be it Noida, be it Gurugram, they were all agricultural lands at one point of time, so which has been taken up. Even educational institutes which are opening in rear flung areas are it. But how do you skill up people to kind of take care of if they're losing jobs, how do you skill people that when AI, etc., or other technologies come, you get jobs? That's one. The sustainability is also affected, if I be the devil's advocate, by the amount of fertilizers, etc., we're using, and the soil is getting eroded. So how do we ensure agriculture happens in such a way that it is more environmental friendly, sustainable to our health, etc.? So there, it's a multiple thing. You know, if you talk about it, there is also talk about nuclear reactors being used for powering data centers, etc., which I think is hazardous in a way. But again, there are some things you can't hold back. But the issue is, where can you, how many do you need? I would say, if you're having data centers, what is it which, you know, every country is welcoming data centers. Okay, let's be honest, we can't stop it. But how do you make them use more sustainable technology? How do we skill our workforce so that they get jobs? Or if they are being displaced, what is the way they can earn their livelihood? I think that is what I think needs to be seen. Because if you speak to anyone, everyone will, I don't think you will be able to stop it, but how do you de-accelerate it to some extent is something you could see. But you can't stop the data centers from coming up, because it is a necessity also on one hand.
Yes, and today's news headline says the Reliance has now gone for $11 billion investment.
Everyone's going.
And no, I just read this one news, so everyone's going, and that indicates that we are going to have more data centers in our villages in rural India, which is a concern for all of us. And on that note, Shashank, from a policy regulatory perspective, moving forward, we are definitely chasing a lot of developments, and we are and you know, there's always a saying from, especially when I hear NASSCOM, when I hear tech bodies, they say that strict regulation impedes growth, technological growth. I would humbly not agree, because I feel like good regulation actually supports very good technology. But what would you say, and your closing remarks?
I'm going to borrow this example from someone else, and I think it's a good one, is that we have so many safeguards and regulation for aviation, right? Does that mean that's impeded any innovation, that we're flying slower, we're flying fewer people? That's not true, right? So I think one question that at CCG we continue to ask is, who makes technology for whose benefit, right? So I think I'm going to just take on from what Amrita was saying, but slightly draw a different path. Is like, I agree with Amrita that I don't think that things are going to drastically change in the next few years, right? But we're in it for the long haul, right? We're in it for long-term change, and which means that we need to change our priorities, and we need to re-envision a new digital future for ourselves, right? And I myself deeply believe in imagining new digital futures, right? So who decides where these data centers are coming up, right? For example, and are the local communities consulted, right? You know, for example, there are examples from Switzerland where the government went to villages and said, oh, we have this nuclear waste and we want to put it in your community, right? And they saw that when they were paying the community to deposit that waste, they said no, but they said do it for national pride, they said yes, we'll do it, right? So I'm saying that, and I'm just drawing this example, is that we are not even talking to those communities. In the outskirts of Hyderabad, Microsoft is establishing a data center. The communities were stripped of their land, right? They were not consulted. It's front page news. This is not something that is hidden, right? And it's going to happen across the country. So I'm saying that, can we consult those communities? Are we doing a survey of is there water readily available? How do we include these communities whose lands we are using to ensure that they benefit? You know, Amrita was also saying this, that how do we ensure that the benefits actually go to these companies, or it's going to Silicon Valley, or it's going to, you know, only Mumbai or Bangalore? So I'm saying that we need to rethink and reprioritize that. Are we benefiting local communities? I don't think we're thinking like that, right? I'll take one example. look at what is happening with Narega scheme right now, right? You have to do an AKYC. You are showing examples that there are villages in the country that does not have internet access. I will not get my daily subsistence if I don't do my EKYC, right? This is front page news. Again, I'm not creating something that's hidden. So I'm just pointing to these examples saying that sitting in Delhi corridors, we think that we can imagine the reality of pan-India, right? I think we're losing our cultural ethos of decentralized governance, right? I am not pro-Gandhian or something, but let's say the Gandhian example of decentralized governance, we're losing that ethos. We talk a lot about local culture, local tradition. I think we're moving away from that rather than giving into that. So not going too much into those kind of esoteric concepts, but I'm saying that I'm just using these examples to draw out a new vision that we need to really reimagine. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Shashank. And then we have 5 minutes left, so we would like some questions. So the youngest member, please give us your concluding remarks.
So I think the theme that we were talking about, these data centers, etc. I was reading a newspaper headline, a very long piece. I really loved the headline which said that data centers need to cool down. And it was because the story arc went it like that there is so much consumption of electricity, water, which is again groundwater depletion. I think it's the worst in India compared to any other country. So keeping all these factors in mind, is the piece talked about it. But the idea is that we need to get a balance between growth and sustainability. I was listening to some government officials during my earlier reporting this week, and there was a unanimous idea that I was getting, that they said that developed countries, the countries which are developed right now, when they were in their development phase and they were designing their infrastructure and all of that, they did not have to think so much about sustainability, land use, everything. It came later. But they also said that India has a unique opportunity to actually integrate sustainability and environmental factors while actually you are creating that infrastructure. So I think there is a lot to take away from there, because right now we are in a zone where we are going aggressive on infrastructure, creating jobs and everything. So we'll have to take into account the sustainability factor, the environment and ecological factors also. That's one. Second is that when we are creating digital hubs, for example, a center which helps people, get assistance on their PAN card, subsidies, schemes. India is one of the countries which is disaster prone, right? It is one of the top countries which is disaster prone. So can we think about something like that whenever we are creating that digital infrastructure or this one room where we are providing digital services, we know that this area is maybe flood prone. The electricity supply in this area is very bad, but we can power this room using solar panels, right? So that is one brilliant way to go about it. Second, we know that this community is rampantly affected with worst of the floods, weather conditions or whatever. Can we integrate the community in a way where they can receive these weather updates in advance, in a closed door loop, and not like that when they have to search for a news and then they find, oh, our region, the weather alert for our region is bad. So can we create systems like that? So these are, I think, areas these are areas of opportunities and very easy to do if we are able to pre-plan and note it in advance and not just as an afterthought, oh, there is a drought, what to do now? So, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so 70% of India is rural India, and I think we should end on that note, that 70% needs attention and with equipped, sustainable, community-informed digital infrastructure and meaningful digital adoption. Thank you so much, and thank you IIGF for hosting this, holding this very critical dialogue. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you for the session. Would request Brigadier Anil Tandon, Director General Broadband India Forum, to please hand out the mementos to the session moderator and the... of course, yes, ma'am. Yes, that's noted. Yes. Mr. Shashank Mohan from CCGNLU Delhi. Miss Udisha Srivastav.
This is a file.
Dr. Arpita Kanjilal from Digital Empowerment Foundation, who've organized this wonderful session. And thank you, Madam Amrita. Yeah, there's a group photo, so request everyone to please be in front. Rajiv sir, would request you to please join the photo. I think we'll have the next session at 12 o'clock here. Yes, so thank you.
ये मत दिखाना, ये मत दिखाना।
नेक्स्ट वाला है इसमें
कर रहे हैं भाई, हॉटस्पॉट ऑन करता हूँ मैं।
मुझे अभी भेजा, इसलिए मैं आपसे पूछ रहा था कि आपके पास ऑलरेडी
इसकी हिस्ट्री में देखना पड़ेगा भाई, पड़ा है
नेट कनेक्ट को सेंड कर देते हैं।
इसमें ही है ना प्रेजेंटेशन फोल्डर में?
हाँ, ये है मेरे पास, फोटो है, अभी सेंड किया तो चेक कर लेते हैं। हाँ, यस
चेक करने दे भाई। भाई किसका है वो? कर लीजिएगा।
Yeah, no, so that started, the whole conversation started. So this case, if you want to come, they said, हाँ हमको आना है, mission. Then they said, then they realized because it's IHF is government, so the condition of IHF is that it has to be open to public. It can't be closed door because money is funded by government. So who's public? हाँ मैंने कहा तो stream भी हो सकता है, सब कुछ हो सकता है, public है, speak है. But IHF telling us to do the same thing. So they said, so then they said, oh no, we can't. Public will hear online, because streamed. But you can't make a statement, is not allowed. Globally, it will take time to put like I understand. Because of the screen there.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Soumya AK. I am an Associate Policy Director at the Indian Governance and Policy Project. Millions of people today are treating AI systems like a confidant, seeking mental health support, preliminary medical assessments, legal guidance, financial guidance, and deeply personal counsel. This behavioral shift is undeniable. Now, in June 2025, the New York Times obtained a court order compelling OpenAI to preserve all user chat logs, including temporary and deleted conversations, as part of ongoing copyright litigation. Sam Altman called it an inappropriate request that sets a bad precedent. AI privilege as a legal doctrine does not exist, so that's interesting. Not in India, not anywhere. Let me give you a scenario. You ask your trusted AI conversational system, my employer is asking me to falsify certain records. What are my legal options if I refuse and get fired? This conversation seeking legal guidance on a potential whistleblower situation sits on a company's server. The AI company retains access to it. It could be used to train future models. And crucially, if that person's employer later sues them or if there's an investigation, these conversations are potentially discoverable. There is no one to invoke privilege on their behalf. There is no framework protecting it. Now contrast that with traditional privilege. If you'd asked a lawyer the same question, attorney-client privilege would apply. So today we are here to unpack a deceptively simple question. Should conversations with AI be privileged, and if so, how? Now, I will say this isn't a theoretical exercise. The doctrine of privilege has always been about balancing two competing interests: the need for candid communication in certain fiduciary relationships and society's interest in uncovering the truth in legal proceedings. Just last month, the Supreme Court reinforced this, holding that Section 132 of the BSA protects professional communications made in confidence between an advocate and a client, and this protection will continue even after the professional relationship ends. On the other hand, in India, Doctors and therapists are covered by professional confidentiality obligations under the Indian Medical Council regulations and the Mental Healthcare Act 2017. Now, when you look at AI, it fundamentally challenges these existing categories. It is not a licensed professional. It does not owe you a fiduciary duty because it's a commercial relationship, not professional. And yet, functionally, you find that it is increasingly occupying space that was held exclusively by professionals. So the question becomes, do we extend privilege based on function, what the interaction achieves, or based on form, the nature of the entity that serves it? Do we risk creating a two-tiered regime if we were to take the latter, where only those who can afford human professionals will get these protections? Now, please note that all of these will have immediate implications, be it in civil litigation, in criminal investigation, in regulatory oversight, and in access to justice. And to help us navigate this, we have exactly the right panel. Kapil Chaudhary, partner at Denton's Link Legal. Kapil brings over 25 years of experience at the intersection of technology, regulation, and corporate governance, having held senior legal leadership roles at Twitter, InfoEdge, IBM, and Junglee Games. Dr. Anup Surendranath, Professor of Law and Executive Director of the Square Circle Clinic at Nalsar University. Dr. Surendranath brings constitutional expertise, deep experience in criminal justice, and a long-standing commitment to access to justice. Previously, before joining Nalsar, he was the S.K. Malik Chair on Access to Justice at the National Law University, Delhi, and was the founding executive director of Project 39A. His teaching and scholarship span constitutional law, legal methods, jurisprudence, and comparative rights adjudication. He also previously served as the Deputy Registrar at the Supreme Court of India and is a member of the Advisory Council of the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights at Oxford. And finally, Kirti Mahapatra, partner at Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas, specializing in healthcare, life sciences, technology, and regulatory advisory. Her practice focuses on data governance, digital health frameworks, and complex compliance challenges at the interface between innovation and regulatory risk. So this means she's already dealing with the real-world versions of this problem. Over the next hour, we will explore whether AI privilege makes conceptual sense, whether it's workable in practice, which is to say, who can invoke or waive such privilege, how will it interact with the existing frameworks that we have, like DPDP and evidence law, and ultimately, whether it is something we actually want. I will now hand over to my colleague Dhruv. Welcome to our panelists, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Soumya. I think you've laid the groundwork for what the conversation could be. I think that was half of the conversation that we would cover, but I think we want to explore the practical implications of what we'll discuss. Just to, before I begin, I would like to sort of lay down the structure of this conversation. I would like to begin with a common question to all of you, correct? Which is, maybe you can give your opening statement, but it will be a conceptual question as to whether in principle or on just first principle basis, should AI models in the nature of chatbots have any kind of privilege, correct, or expectation of privilege? We'll have certain conversations after that, correct, on specific points in different scenarios. And at the end of the conversation, it will be more pragmatic question. I'll repeat the question, but it will be more, it will not be a principle based, it will be more practical as to whether we should actually have it or not, correct? And I'll keep it for the end and see whether anything changes during the conversation. As Soumya has already alluded to, correct, that privilege is a common law concept. The idea of it, while it is considered as an evidentiary rule, in the recent Supreme Court judgment it said that it's not just evidentiary rule, it might be broader, it has certain context of right, substantive right to it as well. But the whole idea was that if I as a person is approaching my legal advisor or an advocate or a lawyer, I should be freely able to disclose enough information without the fear of it being divulged without my consent, correct? And if you see even in the Evidence Act or now the new Adhiniyam, 126, 129 or 132, 134, now it is it's a dual privilege, correct? So the communication is privileged both that the lawyer can't or the advocate can't disclose without the consent. There are some exceptions. And also the person who's communicating cannot be compelled to do so. Obviously, there is exception in terms of they are appearing as a witness or not. So that's the legal sort of understanding of it. Most countries in the common law system follow similar stuff. US has slightly more nuanced understanding under it. In civil law also, I think it's more substantive right based rather than evidentiary. But that's the context of it. Obviously, we can also approach it from a doctor-patient confidentiality aspect. But at least in India, if you see Mental Health Act, the exception is that if a court asks you to produce, you have to do it, correct? So the privilege is not as strong as we have in the case of a attorney-client privilege, correct? While the Indian Medical Council's ethics rules ask doctors to not divulge, but at a court order you have to. So I think the doctor-patient confidentiality stands at a slightly lower footing compared to a attorney-client privilege. Now moving on to the first question as I discussed. All three, this is a question to all three of you. Conceptually, do you think there can be a reason to have privilege accorded to the communication made to AI chatbots, generally or in specific use cases, correct? And any other opening thoughts you have around the issue? And we'll go into the more nuanced and practical bits during the conversation. So I will love to maybe start with Kirti.
Hi, I hope I'm audible. You know, when this question was posed to me, I did think a lot about what does privilege mean in terms of lawyers. Of course, and I don't want to contextualize this only in what privilege would mean to me as a lawyer, for example, but what exactly are we trying to achieve from this concept of privilege? The idea, according to me, with respect to privilege, is that there is a fiduciary relationship that is existing between two individuals, and as a part of that relationship, there is, of course, an enforced duty of confidentiality that applies to the professional who is in receipt of what you would consider communications that have been made to them for a particular purpose. And the larger issue also is that privileged communication is basically something that has to be protected over and above public interest. So privilege comes into question when we are looking at whether that particular communication can be basically communicated to the entire world. So there are two sides to it. One side is, of course, that there is a fiduciary relationship on a professional to keep the communication confidential. The confidentiality is baked into the manner in which the professional is expected to act. It has nothing to do with just contractual confidentiality, for example, because I mean, I could sign NDA, which would be much tougher in terms of how confidentiality would look like with respect to client communication, and it has nothing to do with privilege. Privilege comes into play when a third party beyond this relationship is trying to access that information, right? And for what purpose? And what we are told in jurisprudence is that that purpose could be anything. It could be like basically any purpose which would usually otherwise require disclosure of information does not apply in this particular situation. So public interest is not a big problem, other than where we are looking at possibly commission of an offense, etc. This privilege exists even though there might be larger public interest in place. That is the more core part of what privilege is, what we should be looking at when we are thinking about whether privilege is to protect a relationship or is it to protect a functionality. At a very first instance, my and maybe because I think like a regulatory lawyer, it's all about yes or no or black and white in most instances, though law doesn't work that way. Functionalities, according to me, cannot necessarily have privilege because you're using a tool, you're using a functionality. You don't necessarily have, like you pointed out and like Soumya was talking about, there is no fiduciary relationship over there. I'm using a tool and I have decided to what extent I want to communicate with that tool. The question, however, remains that yes, the communication that has been made with the functionality is highly sensitive. So are we saying that we are trying to protect the sensitivity of that communication, or are we talking about the fact that not just the disclosure but also the disclosee has to be protected, right? According to me, we are not at a point where functionality has to be protected. The law doesn't necessarily work around that, and I'm sure we'll get into more questions about are we going to then accord personality rights, etc., to AI? And obviously, because if you're talking about having the privilege, then you also have to take on everything that comes with that privilege, which is, ethics and professional conduct and licensing in certain cases. Do you want to take that on also? So these are sort of the questions that also need to be thought through. So the answer, according to me, is not yes or no. Yes, AI should have privilege. I think it's about, the question is about what are we trying to protect, and usually it is protected communications of information. And I feel that we have reached this point, and of course this is a pet peeve and I don't want the conversation to be hijacked, but I think it's also about how much does daily regulatory and legal access that exists in our country, for example, in terms of surveillance, in terms of how much power organizations, government organizations have with respect to our data exists today. So are we trying to pass on a privacy and a government access to information question as a privilege issue is also something that I would definitely want to think about.
So that's an interesting take as to what I gather from the comment is that do we really need to get into privilege question? Is it a question of privacy rather, which because we think it's difficult to achieve from a principle perspective, hence we are trying to fall back on a concept like privilege. Kapil, your thoughts on it?
Yeah. Sure. So I'll just build on. Sorry, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to just build on what Kirti said, and thank you for those opening remarks. So look, this is a very multi-layered and complex question. Predominantly, as we discussed, the scope of the privilege is so narrow, the definition is so narrow with fiduciary obligations, licensing requirements. So I'll maybe just give 3 or 4 broad pointers, and then we'll see how we can further build on this. Maybe I'll use the other mic. So yeah, this is better. So look, firstly, currently under any given legal framework in the world, AI does not have a legal personality, right? So let's start from the first principles, and by according or by even discussing, and by the way, thank you Dhruv and IGAP, because this is the very first discussion probably we are having in our country on this, so really appreciate. I must also say, since you're all lawyers and I've just moved to the private practice side, my views are going to be personal, not necessarily of my law firm. Very important, because this is being recorded. So one, AI is not a legal person, no fiduciary obligations, the duty of care, etc., which are core legal principles. So we'll have to dwell into that. Secondly, let's look at the black box problem. Right now, a lot of these AI tools and systems who train on our data, on your data and my data, do give access internally for multiple purposes. It could be user safety, it could be API integration, it could be even sharing data and retaining them on servers, right? So one fundamental question is, if a platform assures you that, say, your data is getting deleted, is it really getting deleted? And if so, can a court tomorrow, and we'll come into the DPDP aspects of essential retention requirements for at least a year, mandatory retention requirements. The question is, what if law enforcement was to come to you and ask you for those data logs, and the way they did it, the New York Times, the court has just asked them to disclose 20 million logs. What happens then? So is zero data retention really a zero data retention? And what's happening with deletion and permanent deletion? I think the third unintended consequence of, let's say, if we were to go down the route of according AI privilege, AI conversations privilege, is there is a huge aspect on obstruction of justice and evidence laundering, which is, criminals could hide confessions. And I'll also come to the issue of insurance, which is, could this catastrophically, could this have unintended consequences of preventing access for law enforcement? Because the AI companies could kind of hide behind the veil and say, hey, these chats are protected, but what if a criminal was to misuse them and cause you injury, right? So there's also an important aspect of law enforcement access. And fourthly, without going into the US case laws, there are multiple. Currently, there is no empirical evidence of a social necessity, right? Which is, does AI require privilege, or are these platforms, without naming them, already so powerful because the whole business models are built on data, and then there are issues on data scrubbing, data scraping as well. And then finally, we could talk about this entire issue of perverse incentives and platform capture, which is, is there a real threat of once AI privilege starts getting recognized and AI starts acting as your and my confidential advisor or confidential lawyer, then is there a real threat of these platforms becoming so powerful that they do a regulatory capture? So those are some of the risks I wanted to point out. Not an easy answer, but I think as the discussion progresses, Dhruv, we'll have to probably dwell on some or each of those. Thanks.
I think, Kapil, that makes a lot of sense, specifically from a perspective of, and while I'll ask you that question maybe later, so how traditional privilege may not be able to extend to AI, correct? And a lot of those elements that you're talking about are more on an analysis of that, correct? But I know it is opening comment, Anup, but because a lot of stuff has been covered. So what I want to ask you specifically is, this would have been my second question, but I'm making it my first question is, I understand that it might be difficult, as what Kirti and Kapil are saying, that privilege has a very unique standing in the law, correct? Mostly considered to be an admissibility issue, or at best now substantive right in a limited context, correct? Enjoyed by a professional bound by certain ethics, certain codes, etc. It's a very sort of complicated legal framework within which it operates. But let's look at, and I know you have talked about a lot about how criminal justice system and generally justice system in India at times forgets the marginalized. We do not understand how legal services or is not democratized in a way that we would want to. In that sense, I understand that it's not that all these AI chatbots, etc., are that easy to access, correct? But we are hoping that with enough broadband penetration, smartphone penetration, some of small language models, etc., there might be cases where it might be slightly more democratized than getting quality legal services. In that specific context, do you see there is some social value to having this privilege, or do you believe, and I'll be straightforward, it is just a way for private sector companies who are sitting on that data to use this concept to not be answerable to courts?
Yeah. Okay. So thanks Dhruv and Soumya and IGAP for having me here today. Completely different context from my usual criminal justice work, defending people who everyone loves to hate. But very interesting set of questions, and I must say I was quite reluctant to accept the invitation because I have no clue of much of what. I mean, I can wrap my head around it, but it's something I haven't thought of in the context of technology. But I thought, but the way Soumya and Dhruv spoke about it, I thought it's an interesting provocation for us to think about certain foundational evidence law questions. So in that sense, I'm going to put on my evidence law teacher hat and try and think. And I think some of these complex questions, and at least as I tried thinking through this, found me going to basic first principle questions, right? And I just want to set it up a bit before I dive into what I think. Now, why is privilege a concern for evidence law? When I say concern, why don't we accord privilege to everything, right? Why don't we accord privilege to our friendships, all our romantic relationships? Why don't we accord privilege to everything and say, right, if I wouldn't be frank and I wouldn't talk with any amount of candor unless you protect my conversation, right? And why is the law so conservative in according privilege to certain relationships, certain professional relationships? And I think at the heart of that, and much of writing around privilege will tell you, that the logic is that you are excluding the use of evidence which should have otherwise been available. right? That you're essentially creating zones of exclusion of evidence that should have been publicly available for a legal proceeding for whatever, be it a criminal trial or any other trial, right? And there, going back to the truth-seeking function, right, that there is an interest in the truth-seeking function in any legal system, truth not just in a criminal context, but more broadly, to understand what is the actual lay of facts, right? So I mean, I just want to supply a reverse provocation to you, that truth-seeking is not the only or even main motivation of a legal system, right? Because if truth-seeking were the only motivation, right, there is no reason to exclude confessions, right? There is no reason to exclude hearsay evidence, right? So in that conceptual understanding of evidence law, truth-seeking is one of the functions, right? In that sense, the legal system, there is a countervailing interest of saying, along with truth-seeking, there are certain other principles we are interested in that contribute to the legitimacy of the legal system, and therefore we need to have certain rules of exclusion of evidence, either through relevance or admissibility or whatever, right? So just want to lay out that to not only think in terms of truth-seeking, right? That to say, okay, what are some of these other foundational principles that speak to the legitimacy of the legal system, where the legal system then needs to account for those principles and then balance it with truth-seeking, right? So just want to lay that out. Now, how does that operate for privilege, right? I am skeptical of a very instrumental understanding of privilege, right? When I say instrumental understanding of privilege, that the idea or justification that privilege is important because if we didn't have privilege, people would not speak with candor or would not speak frankly, or they would not, and that's a very instrumental justification for privilege, that I wouldn't speak to my lawyer if I didn't know that there was privilege, or I wouldn't speak to my psychiatrist if I didn't know, or whatever, right? That's a very instrumental justification for privilege, right? Privilege is important because it will not allow other things to happen, right? I'm skeptical of that. I think, and it's interesting that Kirti brought up privacy, right? Neither do I think that the justification for privilege is privacy in and of itself. I think it is a decisional autonomy issue for me, really. Privilege is a decisional autonomy issue. And for that decisional autonomy, so that I as an individual inherently must have the capability to exercise autonomy and make decisions about my life, privilege is important, right? It's not, and it is to facilitate that decisional autonomy, right? That there are certain core areas of an individual's functioning where if you did not give this privilege, that autonomy would not exist, and goes back to a very Kantian idea of, sorry to name drop, but yeah, sort of goes back to a very Kantian idea of what we are entitled to as human beings, and an autonomy is sort of inherent to that, right? And therefore, and for me, that is the link between privilege, privacy, and autonomy, right? And then we need to be clear about what is the normative justification for privilege, right? And for me, it is not the, and Wigmore, I mean, for those of you who are familiar with evidence law, sort of rock star of evidence law, right? Ancient, old, but adopts a very instrumental view that, you know, if you don't have it, people will not speak, kind of, right? And I think and then on the other hand is all the complications that I think has been alluded to in some sense of fiduciary relationships, right? That a fiduciary relationship represents a certain vulnerability, right? What does it mean that the professional is acting in a sort of zone of extreme and absolute loyalty to the person, to the receiver, to whom they're giving the advice. Right? They're acting in their interests is paramount. You cannot manipulate them. You cannot use them for your profit. Right? So we need to understand what do we mean by a fiduciary relationship. And I think that presents a very immediate and fundamental problem for the kind of AI context that we're talking about. That how do you ensure that the only thing driving this interaction between the user and the chatbot is the interest of and there are no other structures operating. It is not commercial profit, it is not commercial interest or commercial exploitation that is operating in this relationship. Can we even call it, is there any imagination of this where we can call this a fiduciary relationship? And I'm struggling to see that, right? To completely be honest. Now, in terms of Dhruv's question, I'm sorry to come to it so late. In terms of access to justice, connotations for this in terms of legal advice, right? I remain. I don't know. I remain skeptical of the point of how much of this is being driven by a democratizing access motivation, right? And the whole data economy on that. There are just very structural reasons that is this really being built and shaped and designed so that it widens the base for people coming and seeking legal advice as some sort of solution to access to justice gap in this country. I am skeptical. I suspect there are larger motives at play. But fundamentally, I would think, why privilege? What would it mean? And when I say that, when I made all the points about the justification, why would you say that this needs to be accorded privilege, right? And secondly, and I don't think just the sensitivity will answer that point, right? And secondly, the fiduciary relationship. Can this even ever be a fiduciary relationship? Yeah.
So the way I'm looking at it, correct? So I will take the second part of what you said, correct? And this is something when we were thinking, it's something that was we were struggling to sort of wrap our head around, is that while we're talking about AI chatbots specifically, correct? And again, we have to be very careful. We don't have enough time, but still, what we have to be careful of is that while there are general purpose AI chatbots, correct? What we know, Gemini, etc., there are also very specific chatbots also, correct? There are specific mental health chatbots. There are chatbots which may be only coming across as legal advisors. There might be chatbots who are acting as support systems for law firms, and I'll come to Kirti on that, correct? So while I understand on a general chatbot, it's very difficult to do that, but on specific use cases, is there a justification? Yeah. And we can explore that very quickly. I understand the whole difference between deontological and teleological. I was waiting to use those, the dichotomy here.
I'm glad you're the one who used it.
Yeah. So well, I understand it, but at the end of the day, if you are saying autonomy is the one of the ways, correct? So I'm looking at is autonomy as one reason that supplies it. Fiduciary relationship, which sort of casts an obligation on the lawyer to not disclose. So it's still coming across from a sort of conversation, while the fiduciary relationship is only binding that lawyer in a particular framework through which they can't, correct? And those elements relationship may not be supplied by a general purpose chatbot, correct? So I understand the context, but if what I'll do is I want to jump into specific use case and Kirti on terms of Harvey AI specifically as assistant, and we can do. But before that, because I know that Kapil wanted to talk about generally as to why traditional elements, or Anup has given sort of his framework of why it doesn't happen. Maybe a more technical sort of application of why traditional privilege may not extend to AI, Kapil. But second question within that, if you can answer, is that I know you have worked with a lot of tech platforms, correct? You have represented them, you have thought with them, you have you understand how the users approach them, correct? And this is sort of a question that comes from, if let's say we can't accord users AI privilege generally, what should users do? And should we start talking about how should users start looking at this technology also? I know at one time, 10 years down the line, users may be literal enough, but we know right now users don't even know what their social media communications are about when it comes to privacy and how it can be used in court or not, correct? So how should users then approach it if you are saying that it's difficult to extend traditional AI privilege to them? So,
Sure.
yeah.
Great, and thank you, Anup, for bringing out the very interesting principle on decisional autonomy. I'll probably add to that, muddy the waters a bit by saying that inherently between the AI platforms and the users, there is definitely an information asymmetry, right? I mean, I'm a user of ChatGPT. I use it on my phone. I use Perplexity. I use Claude. I use other tools, but there is so much of information asymmetry because the platform knows so much more about me than I know about the platform. So it's not an equal relationship, right? So that's one fundamental aspect. I also want to bring in the a mini elephant in the room, and no disrespect to any animal, which is the mental health issue in India, right? And one of my legal interns who's actually in the room, Trisha, she helped prepare this paper, so really appreciate it. The issue is that we have one psychologist per 2 million people. We have the highest youth self-harm rates, and we have an exploding use of mental health AI tools, where fundamentally as a society, you're also establishing a relationship with somebody who's a non-human. And I want to build on that a little bit. So, fundamentally societies are built on human-to-human interaction. Here you've introduced a new element on sitting on your phone and you're taking advice, you're discussing romantic relationships, marital problems, so on, right? That has very strong societal implications, right? And if those chats are not protected, and let's say, and we are not even talking about the self-harm issue and the fact that one of the large platforms was pulled up because they led an individual to commit suicide, right? So those are the unintended consequences. But in a country where you're already dealing with mental health, you have vulnerable populations and teenagers, by not according protection to that interaction, and by there's also user expectation, right? Or that my chats are protected. There's an element of privacy, as Kirti alluded to. And tomorrow, if these chats come out in the open, what are going to be the consequences on the user, right? So very important to think on those aspects. And fundamentally, we've spoken about data retention mandates, data minimization, which the new privacy law builds on. I would say there is an inherent difference between privacy and privilege. Privilege, as Anup said, is a very narrow concept, no fiduciary obligations. But these platforms, and I'll answer your question quickly, Dhruv, from when we work with companies. So large recruitment platforms, for instance, are now being asked a very fundamental question, two fundamental questions by a lot of vendors, and I won't name either of them. One question they are being asked is, are you using AI models to train on my data, right? And important to understand, I'll say within inverted commas, what is my data? And the second question that they are asking is, are you using AI platforms and tools to train on my data to benefit my competitors, right? So fundamentally, a lot of companies are struggling with this issue of, hey, look, once you are ingesting data, and if you're also according the option of turning off training, so the users now have an option, some platforms, and we'll see how the user designs evolve, the UI UX designs evolve, which is, should I as a user have the option to tell an AI system, I do not want you to train your model on my data, right? And then there are aspects on a lot of enterprise AI applications give you that option, but you have to pay higher. A free version may not give you that option. And then you get into the aspects of data anonymization, pseudonymization, and whether these are adequate protections. So, Dhruv, to answer your question, what a user needs to then do is, one, read, and I know none of us read the terms of service clearly, but I think we'll have to start asking questions from these platforms, which is, to what extent is my data being used to train your models? Secondly, the data deletion, retention requirements will now start getting more active with the data protection rules coming in. So I think platform accountability will start happening more, right? And I think that's a conversation we need to happen. And the third big elephant in the room, which we need to talk about at some stage, is children's data, right? So the DPDP rules now talk about verifiable parental concept. The law is anyway very consent heavy, but what mechanisms are we going to evolve to start protecting our children, right? Because I think that's very important, and all children are actually using a lot of these AI tools. So I think maybe broad-base the argument a little bit more to see unintended consequences on vulnerable populations in our society. The fact that you are talking to a non-human with no legal personality. And third, what kind of safeguards can we start building for our children? I think those are very fundamental questions we'll have to start grappling with.
Yeah, thank you, Kapil. So, couple of thoughts on it, and maybe if we have time, we can get back to it in the second round of questions. That, see, I understand that, you know, if let's say a user comes, correct, and they understand that I'm talking to an AI chatbot, correct, they may understand that this data might be used to sort of train their models, correct? Under the new DPDP Act and the rules therein, except for 3 classes of e-commerce, social media, etc., you have a 3-year retention period. Earlier, under the draft rule, there was no retention period once the purpose is ended, but now there is 1-year retention period, correct? So I think in the Data Protection Act, and we'll see how it implements, correct? There's implementation, which I'm not going into it. There are certain rights that the user have, if they know about them, to exercise them, and that exercise of right is giving according the opportunity to exercise the right is there on the platforms, correct? And I'm assuming going forward after 18 months when implementation happen, even all the AI platforms will have to follow it. So in perspective of that, I think there are some rights that the users have that they can exercise vis-a-vis the platform. My question is, let's look at that 1-year mandatory retention as per the rules that the platform has. Within that 1-year mandatory retention, I know what purposes I have given my consent for data processing, etc. But I have talked about some legal advice from them, or I am using a mental health chatbot, etc. So the conversation I am trying to build is that within that 1-year retention period, where because the rules say so, the platforms can't delete it even if the user asks, correct? That's where privilege will act vis-a-vis the state, vis-a-vis a court proceeding, correct? So I'm saying the DPDP Act as a framework works between the user and the platform. The government has mandated 1-year data retention, and we all know why that case is. And within that 1 period, that's where a privilege may or may not function, correct? And that's the narrow use case I'm talking about. So that's the framework we were building to. And maybe in the closing comments, we can maybe take it up. Kirti, very quickly, I want to go slightly more on specific use cases. We talked about how general purpose chatbots, it's very difficult, correct? But on specific use cases, correct? So I know you are using Harvey AI. It's acting more of an assistant or a supplement for you. We know, legally speaking, usually translators, clerks, etc. are covered by privilege. At least that's what jurisprudence say. We know there are other slightly broader privilege. It's not just about court proceeding, even preparation to litigation is there. So first question, when you're using Harvey AI, are these questions already something that you have answered to your clients or thought about? Second, I know you work with a lot of mental health so clients, etc. I'm assuming some of them will be looking at developing standalone mental health apps, correct? Which are not general purpose, and there will be maybe very soon there will be certain ethical considerations that will bind them also, either through regulation or through some sort of self-regulation. We'll have to see. From those use cases, do you think there is still a case, or do you still think in those cases also it does not make sense to have AI privilege?
Thank you, Dhruv. Yeah, I know when you come down to the specifics of it, there is of course a lot to be said on both sides of what we are discussing here today. Let me come to Harvey very quickly, because I know that was something that you wanted to discuss. Like I said, from a lawyer's perspective, especially a practicing lawyer who's like day in, day out dealing with huge amounts of proprietary as well as confidential information. So it's not just about information about wrongdoing in that sense. It's a whole bunch of proprietary information which, when in the hands of even a competitor or anybody else outside in the world, there are massive implications to commercial operations of organizations, right? We at SAM, of course, take our professional ethics very seriously. So Harvey hasn't just been a let's take an enterprise license and implement it and give access to all of our constituents, access to this AI tool. Harvey was actually a 1.5 year long process for us. We have beta tested it. We had specific teams who would test the product, see what exactly it throws up, and a part of the activity and the work that we did in integrating Harvey into our systems was also to take into account the very key considerations our clients had. Are you going to mix our data with other people's data? Are you going to find solutions which, with respect to my use case, which you're going to implement with somebody else? Will they be able to understand how I am running my processes, and somebody else ends up having the exact same process, so I have suddenly a competitor in the market, when otherwise, I basically it was like a trade secret for me. So we have tried and tested and created systems around how we use Harvey as a tool. And let me be very clear that Harvey is a tool. It is nothing beyond that. It is not a platform that we use to generate legal advice. It is not considered substitution to research, to even putting together advice even on an email, right? So the way we would use let's say a co-pilot in Outlook, that's how we would use Harvey. And to begin with, we actually started with drafting an AI policy on how constituents had to use, lawyers had to use artificial intelligence itself. And the reason the policy existed before we did firm-wide integration of this solution is because we knew for a fact that lawyers were using generally available solutions. Let me give you the example of my team. When team members came to us saying, oh, you know what, Kirti, when I used the ChatGPT like this, I was able to work faster on a matter. They are looking at it from an efficiency perspective. We had to lay down ground rules. We sat down, simulated situations of how we would use ChatGPT, for example, as a team, and what were goes and no-goes for us. So no client information, no personal information, no sensitive data. Now this is hard-coded into our firm's internal policies on how we use chatbots. And after we integrated Harvey, there is now a restriction on us to use general chatbots. We can only use Harvey when we are doing legal work. So it's taking our responsibility as lawyers and the kind of professional ethics that we have to deal with in an offline world into the online world, right? And that's how you deal with technology. So I will again stress the fact that for us it is a tool. It is not necessarily a substitute to the kind of work that we do on a daily basis for our clients. So any concerns around confidentiality, etc. I mean, we have like the draft has been drafted by our chairman. He lists out what is permitted and non-permitted uses. So we have our internal sort of we call ourselves sub-licensees from the firm because they tell us what we can or cannot do with that with the software. So that's about Harvey. On your question about mental health chatbots, this is the reason why I said we need to focus on what exactly are we trying to think about here. Are we thinking about the larger problems, companies which sit on huge amounts of data are facing today in terms of regulatory overreach when it comes to informational access? Or are we talking about protecting communications or private information of individuals, right? What is the problem that we're talking about? And I think they're obviously highly related. On the side of an individual, let me tell you, in India, and I was literally like unable to sit in my seat when Kapil was talking about all the issues that we're going to see with the data law and stuff. A lot of people think that privacy law is a solve for privacy issues, but let me tell you, nobody understands privacy in this country. We are not a private group of people as a country. We love sharing. We understand. We've taken on social media a lot in the way the Western world has taken it. It's a form of validation. The kind of social media use we see in tier 2 and tier 3 cities is way higher than tier 1 cities, right? I mean, I might be highly worried about what data is going on to going online, which company has what data about me, etc. My parents don't, for example, and I'm a parent to a toddler. I freak out about what information, like even when I send videos and photos over WhatsApp, I'm of course worried about, you know, what I'm sharing out there. And I might think that, oh, she doesn't have a Instagram account or a Facebook account, but the point is her data is already out there. And there is a possibility that when she is of legal age, I have already overshared. And we do not come from the kind of society where, you know, if you look at the Scandinavian countries, parents are actively told about how to deal with, oversharing and sharenting and whatever it is, like you can use whatever terminology. So there is a lot to be said about what exactly are we trying to protect, right? And if you're trying to protect highly personal, intimate conversations, I don't necessarily think that privilege is the way, because privilege has to do with a court procedure as to whether courts and fact-finding procedures under law have to have access to that communication. What we and I do not want the privacy conversation to get hijacked by a privilege conversation, is what I'm trying to say. And to your question about medical chatbots, they have existed. It is nothing to do with in the future. I have worked with companies who have basically built machine learning or AI solutions for general use, where they have seen specific use cases, right? One use case has always been chatbot. Chatbots are anything that had the capability to process huge volumes of data. They know that one way to use it is to basically give it to a healthcare organization. That's where we've seen the maximum amount of enforcement. I have seen mental health chatbots coming into place in 2018, when we were in the middle of, you know, discussing privacy and everything else around it, not even Gen AI. And let me tell you one thing that was very interesting for us was when the medical devices rules came in. One of the amendments does call out software as medical device. A lot of people find it surprising. A lot of our clients found it surprising. They were like, are you telling me that if I take my general use solution and put it to a medical use, I have to now go get registered or possibly get a license? They find it very surprising. But the law already treats these tools to be devices where, you know, you cannot take away from the fact that the deployer or the developer has to have liability. So what I'm trying to say is that with mental chatbots, yes, you can discuss privilege, etc., but that's a court-related process, according to me, and can be bifurcated from protection of the information that chatbot is, receiving. And the law already treats them as a regulated product, if I may say so, and accords liability to its manufacturer or to its deployer, saying that, listen, you are the one who manufactured it, or you are the one deploying it. If you are a hospital deploying it, you have laws which tell you how to deploy it. If you are a doctor using it, then you have your professional ethics and your license to think about. So what I'm trying to say is that the law is going to look at it in a very certain way, right? And again, those same laws will also have overreaching. And I'm sorry, like I said, it's a huge problem for me with these extra powers everyone has to ask for information. These powers have always existed in India. You look at our criminal laws, you look at our IT Act, you look at our telecom laws. I mean, all of these laws have extremely broad powers given to regulators to ask for information. So are we worried about that part? That, you know, oh, I have somebody's privileged communication, but I don't want to receive it, but I want to commercialize it at my own terms? Is that what we are worried about? Versus, are we worried about, oh, I need to protect the individual who's trusting me with their data, right? So I think that's where the question lies. And with respect to specific communications, I agree. Health data, like imagine we have a HIV Act, for example. That act very clearly says that HIV status of an individual is sacrosanct. Even hospitals can't, give that information out. How does this apply in the real world to these? It does. Technically, it does. We can't just argue that, oh, it's a hospital's problem. According to me, it applies to anybody and everybody. So if someone's giving that intimate information out, that information needs to be protected. But whether it has to do with privilege, I don't think we are there yet.
No, I think, Kirti, the point is well taken that, privacy concerns, larger construct, correct? I understand. I think we have been sort of grappling with it. DPDP Act is there, and we'll see how it implements, etc. I think why privilege came, correct, and it was actually that narrow use case basically. So there's an obligation on the processor and the fiduciary, correct, data fiduciary and the data processors to respect that. That's an expectation. Obviously, the problem is that there is an exception to it, correct. Currently, the state can ask for a very broad Schedule 7 in the rule for that information. And when that happens, can privilege, and that's the idea because privilege is slightly more nuanced than that, can privilege step in to stop state function in terms of a law enforcement action or proceeding? That was the, I think, the sort of the construct through which we have gone through. But I know the time is over, but
and on that point, I'm sorry because, like I said, it's like a Pandora's box, right? Even with like the reason I would want to set it in privacy is still because I want to argue. Like if you look at the DPDP Act, the government has no responsibility under that law. They get to do with our data whatever they want to, right? So why would they not then exercise a sovereign function with respect to a criminal activity? They'll say, yes, we want to know this. I mean, when it comes to any sort of information that they're seeking, even with respect to mental health, why wouldn't they argue that there is public interest involved? So
true, they will. My point was very limited. Even if they find out, correct? Like let's say the summoning case right now in Supreme Court. Even if they do, the question is admissibility might hit, and it ultimately, I mean, obviously the trouble will be there, but ultimately when conviction happens, before that when you're analyzing the evidence, the court is analyzing evidence, they might exclude that, what Anup was saying, that in the inclusion. But I get your point, as a state versus, but even when we are going to court, even state collected that data at the admissibility state, if I have privilege, I can go and exclude it. But I do get your point that there are other issues that hit it, beyond just figuring out the functionality of it.
Yeah, and my only point here, Dhruv, is that the issue has to be seen from, like Anup said, from an individual's autonomy perspective. It cannot be hijacked as a question of state functionality versus companies trying to protect what is, considered to be their data.
So very interesting sort of answers till now. We know the time is over, but what we'll do is very quickly, maybe a minute each for you for your closing remarks, correct? Whatever you want to say, I would have had more questions, and maybe later on we can sort of delve into it in maybe another forum or maybe one-on-one. But very quick, your ending remarks in 1 minute each. What's your takeaway? What you think? And I would, it's not just a question whether it can fit in privilege or not. I would also want your answers in terms of, okay, if not privilege, within the privacy regime or otherwise, what should we do so that these kind of communication, specifically sensitive communication, and mind you, this is not a social media platform, this is not a communication channel. Users are talking to it as they're talking to another human being in confidence. From that perspective, what can be done if not privilege? Anup?
Yeah. No, even limiting myself to the extremely narrow case scenario that you, case use scenario that you've said, okay, that it's a specific chatbot, it's only on legal advice or mental health advice or whatever, and it's in a legal proceeding and not going to a broader data privacy question. For me, the real fundamental question is, can an AI chatbot be in a fiduciary relationship, right? And I think unless we answer the fiduciary relationship question, even for your narrow use case scenario, we are not going to get too far, right? And I am skeptical of AI chatbot being, given the larger ecosystem within which it operates, of being sharing a fiduciary relationship with the user. And for me, my skepticism stems from that part. I mean, I think all of the others we can think through, but can it really be you're asking a commercially profit-driven company to be in a purely fiduciary relationship with a user. I mean, that, yeah, for me, I'm leaning towards skepticism. Yeah.
Kapil, we get it. That's fair that privilege is difficult, but how do you then, for the user's perspective, if I'm a user, and I have to interact, how do I protect? If the privacy regime with all these exceptions, privilege can't be called no fiduciary relationship, does that mean I should not use AI chatbots for any kind of sensitive conversation? Or if I do, I have to be worried that, it can be sometime invoked by the state or otherwise and called upon.
Okay, lot to cover in a one minute closing statement, but I'll try and do my best. So look, January, February, we have the India AI Summit, right? So the opportunity is unique for us. We've already come up with a new data protection law, unique opportunity for India. I think the answers, so we will not solve it in this room for sure, but I think some of the answers will be found through adopting some frameworks, as Anoop said. I like decisional autonomy and information asymmetry. Look, you have to also understand that privilege, you'll have to involve a little bit of, and also be respectful to judicial integrity. We are all lawyers on this side of the table, and we have a certain obligation to our clients and courts. So I will say, at some level, the judicial pronouncements will start providing some clarity. Who knows, a user takes an AI platform to court, and you'll have a judicial ruling on this subject soon. And then I'll say, I'll still err on the side of caution and say, we will find answers by building enough guardrails, governance. India is building its own AI stack, protection of minors and vulnerable populations in our country. I'll double emphasize that, to underline and bold. We are still a society coming to terms with some of these new tools. The answers are not easy. And I think some of the solutions which you could look at are obviously statutory confidentiality, governance frameworks, risk, and adopt, a kind of like you do in advising your clients, adopt a risk-based approach to say, these are the risks, these are the harms, and these are the consequences. That's the way I'll approach it. But again, a very important conversation which we should be having at the right time, which we are doing now. Thanks.
Kirti.
I think, Dhruv, to answer your question, I would side with Anoop. There is a lot in terms of legal concepts where I'm skeptical about whether we'll be able to define privilege for a functionality as against, an individual. And what it would mean for organizations who are asking for that sort of privilege to be accorded to them or their products, right? It goes down to the entire question of personality rights, etc., and whether companies are also okay with complying with the kind of safeguards that are put in place for people who are accorded privilege in their professional lives, right? That's one part of it. The other part, of course, is that, like you said, if we go till the last very end process of like taking it to court and whether there we are able to argue privilege, I mean, if I think about it and from my perspective as an individual and not as a lawyer, I would definitely want to protect my personal information and what I've considered to be highly intimate to myself. But I think, like the case is with privilege, even where it is accorded under law, it is a case-by-case determination, right, as to whether or not that information is relevant and what are those competing interests that we are trying to balance, which is like Kapil also pointed out. I mean, we have to give some amount of thought to how the judicial process is going to work out. But because you've asked about what does it mean for a user, I don't think it means you stop using AI tools. It's about having a little more, and it has to come from both sides, from the side of the entities which offer this sort of products. There has to be greater disclosure about where the data goes, and not just the fact that they have to disclose data to courts and regulators and stuff, but where they themselves take this data, right? And from the side of the user, there has to be a culture of, like Kapil said, reading those terms and conditions. I don't know if we'll ever get there, but it has to be a decision to use superior technology has to also come with a certain level of understanding of what that technology is going to do to your data. And like somebody said, if it's free, you need to think twice before using it. So there, and whether we'll reach that point is going to be the question.
Yeah. So thank you, all of you. I know the organizers are very sort of eager to sort of stay on schedule. Thank you, all of you. I understand that this is a conversation which is happening for the first time. I think broadly from the lawyers and academician perspective, I think there are certain fundamental first principles that need to be solved. Maybe the answer may not be here. Maybe the privacy regime is too broad and with a lot of exceptions that the answer might not be there. Maybe there is another jurisprudential way of autonomy, correct, as a means in itself, correct. So or end in itself, and then maybe look at a new framework to sort of answer that. Thank you, all of you, for coming, and I hand it over to the IIGF team. Yeah.
Thank you for the organizers for this really timely conversation. On behalf of India Internet Governance Forum, we have certain mementos and certificates for you. So I'd request Mr. Rajiv from Nixie, who manages the .in domain and is an ex-APTLD, APTLDA board member to hand over the certificates and the mementos. First, Ms. Kirti Mahapatra, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for having me.
Mr. Kapil Chaudhary from Denton's Link Legal. Mr. Anup Surendranath from Nalsa University of Law. And we'd also like to thank the organizer, Dhruv Garg and Indian Governance and Policy Project. And we would also request all of you to please stand in the front for a group photograph. Yeah. We would also like to hand over a memento to Soumya and for IGAP, basically. Thank you, IGAP, for organizing this workshop. Yes. A group photograph. The whole team could join in however you guys would like to have it. Please. The IGAP team could join in. Thank you everyone. Please don't forget your mementos. And there's lunch served downstairs.
Hi, how are you? Good. Good to see you.
I recently had that fight with my dad. I don't know the pictures on Insta. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay. Right. Thank you.